The ground trembles. Shattered stone rains from the ceiling as a duel rages in the Academy's grand hall. The banners of Celestia Academy hang torn and burning, casting wild shadows against the marble walls. Hundreds of students crowd the balconies, their cheers and screams echoing like thunder, but every sound drowns beneath the roar of forbidden magic. Two figures stand at the center of the chaos. One, the pride of the Academy, heir to a noble bloodline, eyes glowing with righteous fury, wielding the purest magic sanctioned by the Council. His aura shines like the sun, radiant and blinding. The other, a boy who should never have stood on that stage, weak, insignificant, the one everyone mocked. And yet, his body is wreathed in something no one here has ever seen. Black flames, they twist and curl like serpents, devouring the air itself, leaving trails of darkness etched into the stone floor. That power does not belong in this world. That power should not exist. Gasps ripple through the crowd. Whispers turn into shouts. Impossible. Not that magic, not again! The noble heir raises his staff, light surging. The boy raises his hand, the forbidden flame dancing at his fingertips. And in that moment, the hall itself seems to hold its breath. The clash comes in a single heartbeat. Light crashes against shadow. The ground splits apart. Pillars collapse, sending ancient stone toppling into the arena. Screams rise, but no one dares look away. The black fire roars higher, brighter, swallowing everything it touches, and then, just as the flames erupt, consuming the duel in an explosion that shakes the Academy to its core, darkness. Cut to black. Silence. A voice cuts through. Calm, steady, almost ordinary. Earlier that day, the scene rewinds. Gone are the collapsing walls, the blazing fire, the screams. Instead, a quiet morning sun spilling through the windows of the Academy dorms. A boy sits alone at the edge of his bed, his uniform wrinkled, his books nearly falling apart. He looks tired. Ordinary. This is no hero. No chosen one. Just another student at the bottom of the Academy's hierarchy, mocked for his weakness, forgotten by teachers, crushed under rules designed to break those who can't keep up. But soon, everything will change, because weakness hides hunger, and hunger can awaken things the world isn't ready to face. And now, before the story begins, I want to ask you something. If you found a power no one was meant to touch, a power strong, enough to make the world fear you, would you use it? Tell me in the comments, because by the end of this story, you'll know exactly what it costs. The Academy of Celestia towered above the city like a promise carved into the clouds. Its spires stretched toward the heavens, white stone walls veined with glowing runes that pulsed softly even under daylight. To the people below, the Academy was a symbol of perfection. The place where the strongest of the kingdom's youth were forged into rulers, generals, and legends. But inside its gates, the truth was harsher. Celestia was less a school than a crucible. The strong rose, and the weak were broken. Rules were absolute, punishments merciless, and every corridor was lined with unspoken rivalries. Kyle knew this better than anyone. He sat at the very back of the lecture hall of Convergence, hunched over a desk worn down by decades of anxious hands. His uniform was rumpled, his book secondhand, ink faded by years of use. Above him, the ceiling glowed with enchanted constellations that responded to the magic of the students below. When the lesson began, most crystals blazed brightly. The one above Kyle flickered like a candle about to die. "Circle formation," ordered Master Verdon, the Academy's most feared instructor. His voice was cold, sharp as a blade. "If you cannot form a circle, you cannot form anything." Around. Kale. Golden arcs of light and perfect sigils bloomed into the air. Callan, the Duke's heir, conjured a flawless ring with a lazy flick of his wrist. He smirked as if to remind the room how natural talent flowed in his blood. Not far away, Lear, the Academy's prodigy, formed not one circle but three, each sharper and more precise than the last. He dismissed them with a bored gesture, as though perfection was routine. Cale's attempt wobbled instantly. The circle shuddered, broke, and dissolved into mist. Snickers rippled across the room. Callan let out a loud laugh, earning approving chuckles from his companions. Lear did not laugh. He did not need to. The cold disinterest in his eyes was sharper than any insult. Master Verdun stopped beside Cale's desk. His pale gray eyes scanned the broken lines. He did not scold. He did not sneer. He simply erased Cale's circle with 2 fingers and said, "Again." Cale tried. The circle failed once more. "Noise," Verdun said quietly, his gaze shifting to the rest of the class. Talent without discipline is noise. Discipline without talent is silence. Both are useless. The words landed heavier than a shout. Students laughed behind their hands. Callan smirked wider. Kyle's face burned, but he said nothing. Later that day, in the East Courtyard, the practical exercises continued. Here, stone pillars stood scorched black from years of magical trials, and students lined up to demonstrate their casting. Callan's turn came first. He raised his staff with theatrical flourish, drawing sigils in the air that blazed brighter than the midday sun. When his spell struck the pillar, it carved his family crest in molten gold. The watching seniors applauded politely, impressed but not surprised. Then Lear stepped forward. He breathed in calmly, no wasted motion, no showmanship. The air rippled faintly around his hand. His spell was silent, precise, a bolt that drilled a perfect hole through the center of a neglected target. A silence fell over the courtyard, heavier than applause. The message was clear. Callan was dazzling, but Lear was dangerous. When Cale's turn arrived, he paired with Fen, a student from the borderlands. Fen was steady, respectful, and did not mock Cale like the others. He gave Cale a quiet nod, as though acknowledging they both carried the weight of low expectations. But even with Fen's patience, Cale's casting faltered. His bolt fizzled halfway to the target, dissolving before impact. Master Jurel, overseeing, the session gave a curt nod and moved on, his silence more damning than words. The dining hall later was no kinder. Students clustered at tables divided by unspoken hierarchies. Nobles and prodigies sat near the center, their laughter filling the vaulted chamber. Callan's table roared at every joke he made, no matter how cruel. Lyre ate alone, efficient and silent, ignored, yet respected. Cale sat at the far end, tray balanced carefully on the edge of the table. Fen joined him without hesitation, speaking quietly about home, the frozen rivers of the borderlands, the cedar forests, the way the wind smelled of snow. Kyle listened in silence, grateful for the companionship. Overhead, carved into the stone, walls were statues of past heroes of the Academy. Each figure held a sigil of power, but one stood with empty hands. Most students dismissed it as damaged. But Cale noticed Master Verdun glance at it once as he passed by, his expression tightening before he quickly looked away. Whispers of history ran through the Academy like cracks in stone. The official books, bound in blue and silver, told a clean, orderly story of magic refined and perfected by centuries of discipline. But the dates never quite lined up, and students whispered of a forgotten era, a time when magic was unshackled, when forces now forbidden carved the world raw. Cale lingered. In the library that evening, wandering rows of tomes that smelled of rain and dust, his hand brushed a dark leather volume wedged between neat blue spines. It had no title, no crest. The archivist appeared instantly, smiling too kindly. "That one is misshelved," she said. "Leave it." Her voice was soft, but her eyes were firm. Kyle obeyed, though the image of that book burned in his mind. Night fell. The dormitories filled with muffled chatter, quills scratching late into the hours. Kyle could not sleep. The humiliation of the day pressed heavily on his chest. His steps carried him through shadowed corridors where torches sputtered low. That was when he saw it. A door. It sat in a quiet bend of the north wing, dark wood framed in pale stone. No plaque, no markings. Other students passed it without so much as a glance. Yet Kyle felt it immediately. The hum in the air, faint and insistent, like a heartbeat hidden behind the grain. He stepped closer. The iron handle was worn smooth, though no one seemed to use it. His hand hovered above the surface. For a brief second, runes flickered under the wood, glowing faintly before vanishing. Kyle's heart pounded. He stumbled back, eyes wide. The daughter stood silent, unmoving. But he knew what he had felt. This was no ordinary door. And once it opened, nothing at the Academy, or in the world beyond, would ever be the same. Moments later, the torchlight near the door flickered. For just an instant, the handle shifted, ever so slightly, as if the door had acknowledged him. The north wing held its breath as Cale returned to the door. By day it looked unremarkable, plain wood framed in ash-colored stone. But at night the grain seemed to drink the torchlight, as if the door preferred darkness to be seen clearly. Cale paused, listening. The corridor was quiet in the way deep wells are quiet. Soundless, but heavy with what could spill out if stirred. He set his palm to the wood. For a heartbeat, the temperature changed. Not warm, not cold, but pressure, like air bending around a note too low to hear. Lines stirred under the surface, runes nested inside runes, a script older than Academy alphabets. When Cale exhaled, the door exhaled too. The iron handle turned a fraction, then yielded entirely with the soft click of a lock remembering why it existed. The hinges moved without a sound. Stairs spiraled downward, cut into the Academy's bones. Dust rose in a lazy drift and carried scents the upper halls never knew. Old vellum, oil, something mineral and metallic, like rain on slate. Cale took the first step, then another. Above, torchlight guttered. Below, a different glow answered. Faint, lambent, not flame at all, but a slow pulse that came and went like breath. The stair ended in a chamber that had no business being beneath a school. Shelves caulked into bedrock climbed to a domed ceiling veined with mica. Books lined them 3 deep, their hides mismatched. Deerskin beside lacquered bark, cloth beside hammered sheets of thin metal etched with tiny letters. Strange reliquaries perched where statues would have stood, a glass vial holding ash that never settled, a copper sphere suspended by threads that were not there. A long, narrow bone sealed at both ends by stamped wax. Everything hummed faintly, not as separate voices, but as one low chord that touched the sternum more than the ears. In the center waited a table grown from the rock itself, its surface pitted by centuries of elbows and accidents. Upon it lay a book bound in black, its corners cinched with tarnished clasps that had been opened and closed more times than the metal wanted to remember. No title marked the cover. The leather bore the kind of wear that comes from hands unsure if they are welcome. Kyle approached as if the book were an animal that might bolt. The air thinned. On the walls, reliefs cut into stone showed scenes not found in the blue-bound histories. 2 sorcerers drawing circles that did not touch. Armies facing not each other, but a sky gone dark at noon. A woman with empty hands splitting a river with her gaze. At her feet, a single line of script curved like smoke. The Academy did not teach that alphabet. Cale found he understood it anyway. Claim the truth. The words did not enter through ears. They assembled in the mind with the inevitability of a remembered name. They were not alone. Other fragments flickered. Not images exactly, but impressions with edges. The roughness of rope around wrists, the smell of singed hair, a courtyard of black glass where snow refused to land. A name brushed the inside of Kale's skull and was gone before it could be caught. Not Kale. Another. He touched the black binding. The book woke without opening. Runes embossed so shallow they were invisible in lamplight, rose like fish breaking a pond's surface. Lines linked to lines, forming a lattice that would have been geometrical if the geometry belonged to this age. The hum in the room focused, until every other relic felt farther away, as if distance had become an opinion rather than a fact. He undid the first clasp. Nothing happened, which did not feel like safety. He undid the second, then the third. The book opened of its own accord to a page that should have cracked with age and did not. Ink lay so black it looked wet, characters sharp as cut obsidian. When Kale read, he did not translate. He recognized. The script traced a set of operations simple in their pieces and criminal in their sum. A binding, not on flesh, on light. Above ground, apprentices labored years to steady one element long enough, not to harm themselves. Here, a sequence offered a way to take the obedient part of radiance, the part that let the sun be useful, and ask it to kneel. The room seemed to lean closer. Kale's throat tightened. On the margins, tiny annotations in a different hand mapped, risks the way sailors mark shoals. One note had been scored over and scratched out, then re-etched so hard the quill had scarred the page. Do not breathe the moment you borrow the word. The word, he did not shape it with the mouth. That would have been too loud. He thought it with the care one uses to slide a needle through silk without snagging. Something answered. It did not come from the ceiling or floor, not from shelves or reliquaries. It expanded from the exact space, above the table, as if reality could bulge. A thread of radiance peeled out of the ambient light and hesitated, bright as a cold star. It bent toward Kale's palm, curious. The air developed texture. Each breath had shape. The thread hovered, then kissed skin. Pain would have made sense. There was none. There was only alteration, a sudden fact. The light now possessed weight, and that weight was in Kale's hand. His heart stumbled, then corrected. Around him, dust motes froze, arrested mid-fall, each a tiny planet waiting for time to resume. On the page, a second annotation flared faintly, as if remembering it had been written. Do not keep what you cannot refuse. Claim the truth, said a voice that was not a voice. The impressions returned, sharper, slate under bare feet. Iron singing, someone laughing without sound in a room with no door. The name again, closer. Orith. No, not quite. Oral. Arath. It slid away just when it could have been held. Kyle swayed. The thread of light dragged, the weight of it did, not increase. But his bones remembered that they were designed for a different set of rules. He lifted his other hand, and the thread followed, stretching, thinning, but not breaking. The book's script shifted subtly, the lines aligning with his motion as if the page were a mirror for something the eye could not see. He could form a circle around the thread now, not a beginner's proof, but an orbit, a promise of containment. The hum in the chamber changed key, no louder but brighter, teeth on edge bright. Above, in the Academy proper, a wardstone flickered a single heartbeat late. Kale drew the circle smaller. The thread spun and compacted into a bead, a drop of day caught in a spiderweb. The bead pulsed, slow as a sleeping giant's breath. He exhaled, forgetting the injunction scratched in the margin. On the table, the note flared again, as if trying to be louder. Do not breathe the moment you borrow the word. Air rushed in. The bead cracked. No sound followed. Sound lagged behind the event like a runner who misheard the signal to start. The light did not explode outward. It exploded inward, collapsing toward a point the world had not agreed to own. The shelves shuddered, the copper spheres threadless. Suspension trembled as if it had at last found its threads and remembered they could fray. The glass vial's ash roiled as though something inside had dreamed of wind. Cale tried to release the word. It clung to him, not sticky like resin, but tenacious like a hand that has decided falling is worse than stealing your wrist. He reached for the counterstroke inked in the book's lower corner. 3 strokes, and a silence. Then a second silence, shaped like refusal. His fingers would not move quickly enough for the math, and the math would not slow down for his fingers. Pressure rose. Not gravity, pressure, multidirectional. The sense that every part of the room wanted to occupy the same inch. Hairline fractures traced the table, then stopped in perfect arcs, as if halted by an instruction laid into the stone when it was soft. The bead throbbed raggedly, no longer a breath, but a stutter. It began to cry off strands of light like freezing, rain shedding sheets from a rope. "Claim the," began the not voice again. "Truth," answered another, older, from beneath the bedrock. That second answer did not speak to Cale. It spoke past him, to something that recognized itself in a boy's mistake. The reliquaries woke. The copper sphere spun, then reversed, then spun again without desiring to choose. The ash in the vial thickened, each cinder a memory of flame deciding whether to remember. From a high shelf, a thin veil of dust lifted and shaped itself into an oval that had no ambition to be a face, and yet looked like one anyway. "If he keeps it," said no voice. At all it keeps him. Cale's knees buckled. He used the corner of the table to keep from going down. The bead tugged toward the floor as though there were a drain there. The drain was not physical. It had always been the book. He understood this not as thought, but as a revision to the room's grammar. The bead belonged where the word lived. He had borrowed both. The counterstroke, he remembered, even as his lungs demanded air, he did not have to give. 3 strokes and a silence. Then refusal. He drew the first in the air, with a shaking finger. The bead stretched. He drew the second. The shelves stopped moving. He began the third, and his breath betrayed him again. His chest dragged at air. The rune bent. Refusal crumpled. A crack ran up the wall, relief showing the woman with empty hands. The crack stopped at her wrists and refused to cross them. Shantu, that refusal. Something old and exact touched the scene the way a teacher adjusts a student's elbow. Cale's failing rune straightened a hair's breadth. Enough, perhaps, to let the next thing matter. Footsteps on stone. Not above. Here, on the stairs. He did not look toward them. Vision had narrowed until the world existed in 2. The bead gnawing its own center, and the book's page holding a set of operations whose neat lines had the moral vacancy of a butcher's ledger. He forced the 3rd stroke into place. Silence followed, not absence of sound, but cessation of argument. The bead hesitated. Refusal became a structure. The bead stopped falling. It did not stop being wrong. His muscles trembled with failure deferred. Sweat ran cold along his spine. The reliquaries settled a fraction, like birds adjusting on a branch that had just remembered wind. The copper sphere's spin found a rhythm and pretended it had always had one. The ash drifted in place, as if the idea of gravity had been explained to it sternly by someone it trusted. The book turned its own page. Cale had not told it to. The leather creaked anyway, and the next spread revealed a diagram of a circle with no circumference, lines so delicate they looked like moth wings pressed under glass. At its center, a single character sat, untranslatable because translation would have counted it, and counting it would have made it die. The margins swarmed with hand after hand of annotation, dozens of minds disagreeing with each other in ink. Most of them ended the way warnings end when their authors know they will be ignored, with a smaller script, then a line, then a dot. as if the writer had looked up and decided the rest of the sentence should be lived instead of written. "Who are you?" said a voice from the stair. It was human, this one. Older than Kale's, rough at the edges by choice rather than neglect. Not Master Verdun. Verdun's vowels were winter. This voice had iron filings in it and a scar under the tone. A torch's glow stretched into the chamber a heartbeat later. Then the torch itself. Then the hand holding it. Kale did not turn. He could not. Movement felt like something that belonged to a previous agreement with his body. He held the refusal in place like a lid on a pot that wanted to boil over and take the roof with it. "Step away from that table," the voice said. It did not rise. The calm was not kindness. It was a carpenter's calm when measuring a beam, before deciding whether to cut. The bead pulsed once, twice. In its surface, a reflection formed, not of the room but of the sky at 4 different hours, stitched together badly. Noon overlapped dusk, overlapped a kind of dawn that did not belong to this latitude. Each time it pulsed, Kyle felt a notch carved out of a part of him that had nothing to do with flesh. The torchbearer stopped just inside the threshold. The light fell across boots scuffed in a workmanlike pattern. The figure took in the circle that was not a circle. The book, the reliquaries, the bead like a trapped syllable refusing to be spoken. "That is not yours," the figure said. Not to scold, not to accuse, but to state what gravity states to cliffs. Kale's breath hitched. The refusal faltered. The bead lunged. It struck the table, not with impact, but with decision. The carved fractures blossomed outward, then froze in a ring. On the wall, the woman with empty hands seemed to lean forward out of the stone. For an instant, the entire chamber inverted, up becoming a suggestion, down a rumor, and then righted itself with the brittle clack of a bone resetting. The torch dropped. The flame did not go out. It crawled up its own smoke, confused. The figure swore softly, the kind of profanity that belongs to craftspeople and surgeons, when material or flesh behaves like itself instead of like they need it to. Kale dragged. The counterstroke's silence shut like a door in a storm. The bead unraveled, not outward. It unwound into a thread finer than hair, then a filament finer than thought, then nothing at all that any room had a word for. The pressure vented. Shelves. Remembered they were shelves. Dust remembered it was made of small resignations. The hum returned to the note it had held when Kale first entered, only a quarter tone different, as if the chamber had learned a new fact and would never unlearn it. Kale sagged against the stone. If he closed his eyes for a breath, it would be sleep and not blink. He did not close them. The book's page lay quiet. The diagram waited the way cliffs wait for tides. On the margin, the scored-over warning had grown a second line, written in a hand that had not been there a moment before. If you can do it once, you can do it by accident. He lifted his hand from the air as if it weighed a child. The torchbearer lowered the flame enough to see his face. Recognition flickered. Surprise buried carefully under training. The figure took another step, then stopped again, the way a handler stops when a horse remembers that it used to be a river. "Leave the book," the voice said quietly. "Step away, slowly." He tried to obey. His legs shook. The table's edge had claim on him his muscles could not deny. Something behind the shelves moved. No sound accompanied it, because the movement was not of wood but of space. A thin seam revealed itself where there had been only rock, and from that seam a slip of air leaked that had not participated in the room's decision since the room was dug. It smelled like first rain on dust in a place that had not known rain. The bead was gone, the refusal held, the chamber had righted. Still, the seam opened the way a mouth opens when a thought becomes too large to keep between teeth. On the other side was not another room. It was a continuation of the same room if the room had been built by a different agreement about measurement. A ledge extended 3 paces and then did not extend, because length had become something negotiable. Farther in, a shape waited that was not content to be looked at from any single angle. At its center, the very faintest glimmer of a script that did not believe in alphabets, wrote itself and rewrote itself, and paused as if wondering whether it had been seen. Kyle's balance shifted toward the seam without his consent. The torchbearer hissed a breath. "Boy," the voice said. No iron now, only urgency that did not have time to be fear. "Do not." The seam widened a fraction more. Kale's heel slid on the stone dust the bead had shaken loose. His palm slipped on centuries of oil rubbed into the table's lip by hands that had learned these lessons and forgot them and learned them again. The book moved to meet him, not physically. Its meaning did. Words on its page swam and offered him a smaller, quicker operation. One that began with the same first syllable as the binding, but ended with a chord that borrowed heat from shadow. His mouth shaped the first part before he knew it had. The seam brightened, and the chamber, which had been patient until now, decided patience was no longer the correct response. The morning after the incident beneath the north wing, Celestia's courtyards hummed with a sharper edge. Ward lamps along the arcades flickered a fraction out of rhythm, and the sigil plates embedded in the flagstones took an extra heartbeat to recognize passing students. Most did not notice. The instructors did. A notice went up at first bell. Controlled duels for first and second years would be held in the lower arena. Attendance mandatory. The announcement was routine. The atmosphere was not. Master Verdon's signature at the bottom carried its usual winter chill. Master Jarrell's counter-signature added weight like a hammer resting on a table. Silent, but undeniable. The lower arena was a bowl of pale stone set beneath the main lecture halls, ringed by latticed wards that softened heavy impacts and archived every measurable detail of a spell. Students filled the tiers, their robes a shifting sea of colors and crests. At the center, ward runes formed concentric circles that rose and sank as proctors tuned the field to controlled parameters. No lethal escalation, no damage outside the ring, automatic suppression if anything breached the outer veil. Kale arrived with Fen and took a place among the lowest tier of competitors. Callan stood across with his cohort, blue and gold shining a shade too bright for daylight. Lyre waited off to one side beneath the arch, hands in sleeves, gaze moving not over people but over patterns, angles of stance, breath signatures, the way the air pulsed over the ward lines. Pairs will be drawn, Master Jarrell announced, voice carrying cleanly without amplification. You will demonstrate discipline, control, and respect for the arena. Those who attempt theater will find the arena unmoved. A ripple of laughter, quickly stifled. Callan smiled like the joke had been. His name's unfurled from a floating strip of vellum, ink writing itself with the casual precision of an expert clerk. Early matches cycled through the expected. Textbook exchanges, bursts of sanctioned light, careful shields, the occasional clever feint that earned murmurs from seniors in the back rows. When Kale's name appeared, paired with Dagon, a compact, second year known for heavy stance and hammering force, the noise of conversation dipped. Not silence, not yet. Curiosity. They stepped into the ring. Wards rose, a gauze of translucent lines stacking into a dome. A measuring obelisk at the edge brightened, calibrating to their resumes, their previous outputs, the expected range of their reach. Ready, Master Jarrell said, not asking. Dagon opened with the Academy's safest dominance play. A broad foundational wave meant to knock a weaker caster off balance and force a defensive posture. The ward lines swallowed the excess, turning what could bruise into what could only stagger. Kale's feet slid a fraction. He centered, breathing steady. On the tier above, Callan leaned to a companion. Watch, 1, 2, and he did not finish the sentence. Kale lifted a palm and shaped air. A standard counter-circle coalesced, angled to bleed the momentum away rather than meet force with force. It held. It was ordinary. It was correct. And it cost him nothing he could not afford. Dagon recalibrated, respect flickering across his guarded face. The second exchange came sharper. Dagon braided a double strike, visible primary, hidden secondary, aimed to slip through habits and punish those who learned by pattern. Kale's eyes narrowed. The book's memory, not words, not a voice, but a geometry that had not let go, turned, his attention a half beat before the reveal. He pivoted, bled the primary into the ring, and pinched the seam where the secondary would emerge. The seam folded. The strike failed to be born. A murmur rippled through the tears. Fenn's fist tightened against his knee, the motion of someone who had just exhaled. "Clever," Lear said softly to no one, as if noting the weather. Dagon abandoned feints and drove at the center with disciplined ferocity, each bolt delivered, like a smith's stroke, exact and compounding. Kale absorbed, diverted, stepped, not back, but sideways, always finding the place the force wanted least to go. His own returns were modest, precisely scaled, the kind of casting that earned solid marks and little notice. He was buying time. The obelisk ticked numbers only proctors could read. Master Verdun did not look at it. He watched Kyle's hands, the micro-hesitations, where instinct negotiated with instruction. His expression did not change, but the set of his shoulders did. Third pass. Dagon drew on the ring itself, within rules, within discipline, and attempted a collapse, a legal maneuver that forces an opponent's circle to choose between breaking and burning far too much energy to hold shape. Kyle let his circle choose a third option. The choice was a memory of a diagram with no circumference. The ward lines hummed. For 3 heartbeats, the air around Kale gained texture, a faint shimmer like heat seen over stone on a cold morning. The measuring obelisk blinked a single, uncertain pulse. Kale's circle did not break. It thinned, widened, and became a path. Dagon's collapse found no edge to crush and spilled harmlessly along a curve that had not been there a moment earlier. Silence, gathered in pockets. Callan's smile faded. Lear's attention sharpened enough to cut. Kale did not press the opening. He shouldn't. He knew it with the part of him that still recognized rules written in stone and penalties carved into ledgers. But the arena was a crucible, and names are made when heat coincides with witness. He lifted his hand. Not high, not grand. He borrowed a fraction of the room's light the way a smith borrows a fraction of a flame to test steel. The ward dome flickered. No sound, just a half-tone change visible only to those watching too closely. Between Kale's fingers, something formed that was not a bolt, not a blade. A contour, a suggestion of a line that implied a destination. He kept it small. He kept it tame. He gave it exactly as much weight as a rule could forgive and sent it, not at Dagon, but at the space Dagon would have chosen if Dagon were Kale. It struck the flagstone an inch from Dagon's leading foot and detonated into nothing. No light, no heat, a gesture, a demonstration of capacity rather than an attack. The wards read it, fumbled for a category, and filed it under permitted anomaly. Dagon halted. To his credit, he bowed a fraction, accepting that the conversation had changed. He raised both hands and attempted a reset. A wide, formal arc inviting Kyle to re-engage on vetted terms. Kyle stepped in and finished the match with sanctioned form. Clean, efficient, the Academy's seal stamped onto the ending. Dagon went to a knee, the ward line sank. Noise returned to the tears all at once, louder than before, the kind of sound that cannot decide whether to be approval or appetite. Maybe the weakling isn't so weak anymore, someone said, not loudly, not softly, in the tone of a rumor, about to become a fact. The sentence leapt rows and changed voices as it went. Maybe he isn't so weak, became, "Maybe he's been hiding," became, "Did you see the dome?" became, "The obelisk blinked. The obelisk had blinked." Master Jarrell marked the ledger with an uncharacteristically careful hand, as if precision could dilute what he was writing. Master Verdun's pale eyes tracked the residue of the ward's hesitation, the way hunters track the space where a deer had been. Matches continued. Kyle returned to the tier and sat, breath steady, posture still. Fen clapped him once on the shoulder, quiet, firm. Callan did not deign to speak. He did not need to. His attention returned to the ring with a certain hunger. Lear watched Kale, without looking at him. When Callan's match was called, he performed as expected. Light braided into a spear, shield blooming at the perfect angle to cheat a heavy strike of its weight, a finishing flourish that left his opponent dazzled and unharmed. The crowd enjoyed it. The obelisk, obedient, recorded nothing unusual. Lear's turn drew less noise. He threaded silence into speed and precision, winning with as little spectacle as possible. In the margin of the ledger, Master Jarrell wrote the same note he always wrote for Lear, restrained to the point of danger. Between bouts, whispers pooled and rerouted like water around stones. Kale caught only their shapes, not their words, but shapes were enough. Attention had a taste, metallic and sweet. After the bracket closed, instructors ran targeted drills to extract lessons. Kale's pairing placed him opposite a senior proctor skilled in destabilization. The exercise was designed to provoke a mistake, repeated micro-shifts in pressure and angle that tempt an overcorrection. Kale held form through 3 cycles, faltered, on the 4th, recovered, and, without meaning to, reached for the thing that wasn't quite a circle. The ward lines brightened, then dimmed in a rhythm none of the proctors had set. Master Verdun's head turned. Master Jarrell's chalk paused, mid-stroke. On the high tier, 2 robed figures from the administrative wing had appeared without announcement. Their presence meant the ledger would be read today by more eyes than usual. Kyle stopped. He took a breath. He finished the drill with orthodox steps, accepting a controlled failure, rather than drag the dome into negotiations it was not built to win. It should have ended there. Instead, a volunteer from Callan's cohort called for an exhibition, a friendly bout between the morning's key standouts. The suggestion carried the unmistakable cadence of a dare wrapped in courtesy. The seniors approved. The crowd settled into that bright, brittle quiet that precedes both comedy and violence. Kale and Callan stepped into the ring. Controlled, Master Jarrell reminded, gaze landing on Callan a half-beat longer than on Kale. Callan bowed, precise, appropriate. When he straightened, his smile did not reach his eyes. "Show us," he said conversationally, "the new trick." They opened with Academy form. Callan pressed, testing edges. Kale yielded where yielding was wise, and refused where refusal taught the right lesson. The first exchange resolved to parity. The second tilted in Callan's favor by a hair, enough to raise a cheer. The third teetered. Callan escalated within rules, drawing from the dome's upper radians to sharpen his next sequence. The obelisk flared to mark the draw. Kale saw the angle, not with sight, but with memory of memory. A diagram, whispering that edges are choices. He laid a line along Callan's path. Not a wall. Walls invite battering. A slope. Callan's strike slid, lovely and useless, along the surface into a safe arrest where the ward wanted it to go. Gasps landed in a wave. Callan's face did not change, but the strike that followed had more intention than grace. He aimed not at Kale's center, but at Kale's mistake, an insult disguised as pedagogy. The arena had seen uglier. It would not intervene. Kale let the strike find nothing, then answered with something the Academy recognized. A clean, orthodox pattern delivered with such exactness that even Callan had to meet it properly. When Callan parried, Cale rewrote the rhythm, half-beat pause, quarter-beat advance, and stepped into the space Callan's style always left empty. The finishing touch was as conservative as a signature on a ledger, a sanctioned bind and release that put Callan on one knee without bruise or scourge. It was not spectacular. It was undeniable. Silence. Then a rolling sound like stone, remembering it could be water. Not cheers. Not yet. The crowd's first instinct was disbelief. Disbelief transformed quickly into exhilaration, as if they had been granted permission to witness something they would later pretend they had expected. First true victory, one senior said under breath. The words meant for the ledger more than for students. Master Jurel, who rarely editorialized, wrote a small mark beside Cale's name that he did not explain. Callan rose with the polished poise expected of a duke's heir. He bowed, the angle exact. When he turned away, his jaw worked once, twice, and stilled. Lear, watching from shadow, closed his eyes for a heartbeat, as if accommodating a new variable. By the time the students filed out, the whispers had found their phrasing, and would not let it go. Maybe the weakling isn't so weak anymore. It clung to cloaks and traveled up stairwells. It would be waiting by supper, like an invited guest. Instructors lingered to argue with the ward logs. The obelisk's record showed spikes that did not map to any sanctioned pattern. Twice during Cale's matches, the dome had registered a shape, for which its lexicon had no entry. The entries were blank, where there should have been numbers. Blankness, in a system that measured, was the loudest kind of noise. Master Verdun watched the arena empty until only staff remained. He stood very still, the way a man stands who has counted his steps and intends to spend none by accident. Then he turned and walked the inner corridors without haste, passing the frieze of founders, the figure with empty hands, the carved rules that never stopped being rules. At the council antechamber, he paused only long enough to ensure his expression had no edges the wrong eyes could cut themselves on. The sentry opened the door. The room beyond smelled of parchment and unlit oil. Verdun stepped inside. He should not have this power, he said. Callan chose his moment with the elegance of a practiced hunter. The lower arena had barely emptied from the morning brackets when he stepped onto the central stone and let his voice carry beneath the dome. "Cale," he called, bright as a bell and twice as cutting. "Since you found your footing, come stand on level ground." The invitation was dressed as courtesy. Everyone heard what it was. Students flowed back into the tiers as if pulled by tide. House colors gathered in tight knots. Seniors reclaimed their vantage along the upper rail. Fen hesitated at the arch, searching Cale's face for any sign of refusal. Cale gave none. He descended the steps with an even pace and crossed into the light. Master Jurel and two proctors took their places. Master Verdun appeared on the far side like a shadow had remembered to be a man. Lear stood off-axis beneath a pillar. Expression unreadable, attention too precise to be disinterest. "Exhibition duel," Jurel announced, tone ironed flat. "Parameters: controlled, non-lethal, two-stage escalation. Ward suppression authorized if thresholds breach." Callan smiled and bowed a measure deeper than required, the depth that says magnanimity and implies hierarchy. "No tricks," he said pleasantly. "Let's show the first years what discipline looks like." Cale inclined his head without speaking. The ward dome rose, its lines stacking to a crystalline sheen. The measuring obelisk warmed from dull coal to banked ember. Callan began with pedagogy disguised as aggression, clean form, textbook angles, radiant pressure layered just enough to pry open bad habits. It was a public demonstration of how an heir is taught to win, not by surprise, but by inevitability. Cale met it with steady, orthodox deflections, the kind a cautious teacher would underline. He yielded ground without ceding control. He bled force into safe arcs. He answered each question with a correct line and no commentary. The crowd settled, disappointed in the absence of spectacle, and then, gradually, impressed by how long absence could be maintained. Callan raised his hand a fraction. The ward lines brightened a hair as he drew licensed energy from the upper radians. He braided a spear of light so clean the dome's lexicon labeled it before it finished forming. He sent it not at Kale's chest, but at the space where a misstep would place Kyle's throat. Kyle shifted a half-beat early. The spear shaved emptiness. Its wake tugged at his collar. He lifted a palm, and for a blink, traced a curve the ward did not recognize. The spear kiss slid, obedient to geometry, and sank into a harmless arrest against the ring. In the tears, whispers leaked like steam. Lyre's gaze narrowed. Verdon's weight shifted onto the balls of his feet. Callan's smile did not alter. He changed cadence, shortening intervals so precision could be mistaken for speed, then lengthening them so the memory of speed would prompt overeager parry. He pressed Kale into the shallow end of the ring and made the space around him smaller. With every breath, Kale's breathing stayed measured. He gave the arena what it insisted on: control, 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 and stole seconds where he could. An angled deflection that cost less energy than it looked, a compounding counter that never quite declared itself. He was buying time with correctness, a currency the dome respected and the crowd undervalued. The first escalation struck without flourish. Kalen feinted high, pivoted low, and split his strike into a twin laceration that would have ripped lesser circles to ribbons. Kale answered the first with sanctioned bind, absorbed the second with a slip that was nearly, but not entirely, Academy. The obelisk blinked and pretended it hadn't. Callan stepped through the pause and clipped Kale's shoulder with a legal shock that numbed the arm to the elbow. Fen flinched. A sharp intake of breath swept the lower tiers like grass bending to a gust. It was not dominance. It was notice served. Callan's tone remained cordial. "You're better when you stop thinking," he said, soft enough that only nearby Rose heard it. "Try it." Kale's answer came in motion. He spun a shallow circle that any instructor could have sketched with a bored wrist, then let the inside edge fail on purpose. Callan struck at the perceived opening and found it wasn't one. The strike funneled into an exit Kale had placed where exits do not usually live. For the first time, Callan's eyebrows lifted. The second stage of escalation clicked like a hidden gear. The dome's light cooled fractionally. The air thickened around ankles. Proctors adjusted their grips on suppression rods. Jarrell's chalk hovered, ready. Callan obliged the audience. He spread his hands and called down a latticework of luminance that webbed the ring, legal, spectacular, and engineered to reward boldness with punishment. "Let's measure your rise," he said, amiable as a host announcing a game. Kale set his feet. The lattice dropped. He moved nowhere the net expected. When strands converged, he altered the angle by the smallest betrayal. When pressure localized, he made himself a slope. It wasn't speed. It wasn't luck. It was an argument with the space inside the ward that the ward considered reluctantly and accepted. Murmur swelled into voice. The tiers, even the senior rail, tilted forward. Callan adjusted midfall, snatching threads from his own net to braid a blade. He cut, not at Kale's defenses, but at Kale's timing. The blade's harmonics were tuned to flay rhythms apart. It struck. Kale's timing tore. He absorbed wrong. Heat licked ribs. The world narrowed to a ring the size of a breath. Instinct reached for safety and found none. Under the stone and the sanctioned light, something else woke. The change was not visible, not immediately. It arrived as silence that had weight. The ward lines dimmed one shade on the far side of the dome, as if a cloud had crossed the sun beneath the earth. The hairs along Kale's arms lifted. Between his fingers, a contour collected that the arena had no word for. Not darkness, not absence, a density, a fold in brightness itself. Students closest to the rail felt the urge to lean back without knowing why. Kale did not fling it. He didn't need to. He gave the fold a destination. Small, deliberate, humane. The flagstone at Callan's lead foot. Then he let geometry do what geometry does when introduced to a new rule. The fold arrived without noise. Light around it bent, and, for the breath it existed, acquired mass. Callan shifted instinctively, and so did the blade he held, drawn a hair, toward the heavier curve. The cut missed by the thickness of a pulse. The fold unraveled into nothing, as if embarrassed to be seen. For a half-second, the arena forgot to applaud. Then sound returned all at once. Awe, disbelief, hunger. Callan recovered with grace, born of breeding and training. His smile flattened into something honest. Again, he said. They traded strikes that would have written both names into any ledger on any day. Callan's discipline met Kale's refusal to be where he didn't choose to be. The measure obelisk recorded values no one would be permitted to read until the council had finished their dinner. Callan took position for the finish, the Heirs Classic. 3-beat build, 2-beat feint, 1-beat decisive line. Every child of a noble house learns it. Every academy ring has admired it. Every crowd wants to be present for the version that will be called definitive 10 years hence. Kyle saw it coming and knew proper answers. He also knew the edge of his strength and how far away it sat. He reached again. Not wildly. Not with that sumptuous hunger the forbidden thing was built to feed. With surgical dishonesty and a whispered apology to rules no one was listening to. Between his palms, a filament closed. It was not black. Black would have been a color. It was the world deciding, briefly, to become narrow. He shaped the filament into a hinge, the way a mathematician folds paper to make impossible lines agree. Callan's finishing line arrived on time. Kyle presented the hinge exactly where tradition insisted there would be air. The line bent, not broken. Not muted, bent, and in bending, delivered itself into a harmless cul-de-sac that waited like a polite but relentless usher. Kale stepped through the empty place left behind and placed a sanctioned bind against Callan's wrist with the tenderness of a physician setting a bone. Callan went to one knee, not forced, not humiliated. Completed. Silence landed, wide-eyed, mouth open, one long indrawn breath. Then the lower arena erupted. Cheers stampeded around the bowl and collided in the middle. Students leapt to their feet. Fenn's face cracked into a grin so sharp it looked like it might cut him. Even a handful of seniors struck the rail with open palms, that archaic acknowledgement of a bout executed cleanly enough to be instructive. Kale stepped back, the dome lowering in a shimmer. He kept his hands at his sides and his eyes down until protocol allowed him to raise them. When he did, Callan was already standing. The Duke's heir bowed with flawless poise. The angle was technically proper and fractionally tight. Across the arena, Lear exhaled through his nose, a sound almost like amusement and closer to alarm. His gaze tracked the spaces around Kale rather than Kale himself, the way a navigator watches currents, not boats. Master Jurel inked the ledger with the same careful hand he used for accidents and miracles. The obelisk cooled. The ward remembered it had rules. And over the roar, in the sliver of quiet that lives beneath crowds, voices in the shaded archways did not cheer. They conferred. "He's awakened it," one murmur said, almost pleased. Another corrected, almost afraid. "No, it awakened him." In the days after the duel, Celestia's rhythm changed the way a room changes when someone begins listening. Bells rang on time, classes proceeded, and sparring circles still sparked beneath the warded sky, but conversations paused when Kale entered a hallway and resumed half a beat later with different words. It was not only students. Instructors adjusted lesson plans with the delicacy of surgeons. Proctors lingered longer at the ends of corridors. The academy was not merely watching, it was aligning lenses, The first lens belonged to Master Verdun. He did not summon Kyle or scold him in public. He simply appeared, on mezzanines, in the library stacks, at the edge of training yards, close enough to see handwork, far enough to be deniable. When Kale traced sanctioned circles, Verdun studied the shadows between strokes. When Kale bowed, out of a match, Verdun watched the space his body had just vacated as if space itself could confess. Others began to surface from the Academy's woodwork with similar precision. An archivist who once stamped, passes with gentle inattention now asked for the exact shelf and page before producing a ledger. A scribe in the records annex recatalogued injury reports from the lower arena and misplaced the ledger for an afternoon, returning it with fresh stitching along the spine. A groundskeeper swept the north wing corridor at unusual hours, bristles whispering over flagstones where hardly any traffic passed. They were not a committee. Committees announced themselves on parchment. They were an arrangement, the smallest, visible portion of a structure designed to be mostly submerged. Older students had a term for them in private: the Veil. Officially, no such faction existed. Unofficially, their seals never needed wax. Hints had always been part of Celestia's architecture, friezes of founders whose faces had been smoothed by a sculptor's second thoughts, rules carved into pillars with curious omissions between numerals, histories bound in blue with dates that bent around blank winters. Now those hints gathered weight. In lecture, a visiting magister delivered an immaculate treatise on refractive fields, then paused at a harmless question and said, too easily, "Some paths are not in the curriculum." In the dining hall, portraits overhead seemed to tilt by a degree the day Kyle passed beneath. In the observatory, a graduate assistant carefully shut a cabinet as Kale approached and locked it with a key that had no visible teeth. Students noticed pieces, never the whole. Those who watched patterns the way Lear watched them noticed most. Lear's gaze tracked not Kale, but the wake Kale left in rooms. The tiny slips in instruments, the half-tone changes in ward light. The way two instructors who rarely agreed now found themselves aligned in silence. Fen noticed something simpler. Kyle's silences lasted longer at night. Meanwhile, other names began to thin out from attendance rolls. Doggin, the compact second year whose stance had been a lesson in weight, missed a practical then two. An empty bed replaced the quiet rhythm of his breathing in the dormitory. Whispers said he had been injured. The infirmary ledger did not reflect it. A third year known for cleverness, Sarah, stopped appearing in the stacks where she used to. Hoard commentary on commentary. Her friends said she'd transferred to a provincial academy. The transfer lists had no Sarah that term. A first year with a talent for illusions failed to report for breakfast and was later said to have withdrawn. The withdrawal form bore a signature that looked correct until compared with the student's registration. The loop of the final letter was too perfect. Celestia did not relish ugliness. It avoided it with policy. Yet ugliness pooled in corners, all the same. Beneath the north wing, the hidden stair remained closed. The door learned how to look ordinary again. Kale did not return to it in daylight. When he passed the corridor at night, the torch closest to the door burned an imperceptible shade lower than its twin, as if conserving fuel for a darkness only it expected. The Veil's attentions sharpened. A ritual safety seminar was added to the week's schedule, led by a soft-voiced enchanter whose students rarely failed. Her lesson was exquisite and neutral. Midway through, she asked for volunteers to demonstrate a textbook recovery from destabilization. Kale volunteered. Her smile touched nothing above her lips. She watched his hands the way a lock watches a key it did not expect to fit. Master Verdun began to request copies of ward logs directly from the lower arena, bypassing the normal review chain. Master Jarrell, who hated bureaucracy but obeyed systems, initialed each request with the same small mark he had placed beside Kale's name after the victory over Callan. The obelisk's recordings were pristine, except in places where they were not. Twice in the span of a week, the lexicon returned a null entry. The systems engineer, a taciturn woman who measured her life in calibrations, swore under breath, and wrote a note to herself that said, "Not an error, an omission." Lear began to shadow the veil without ever announcing he was doing so. He arrived early to lectures he had never before valued, listened to instructors whose methods he once found wasteful, and lingered in the archives to watch who used which keys. Kalen, for his part, returned to spectacle. He performed brilliantly in the arena, chaired a study circle with icy finesse, and made sure every laugh landed when and where it should. If his eyes cut right when Kale entered a room, if his jaw set a fraction tighter, those were private adjustments. Under the surface, rumors coiled. Some said the council had in its keeping a ledger of awakenings, a list of students who had touched what statutes called impermissible primitives. Others claimed the Academy had struck a compact after the ancient war. Celestia would guard the door to the thing beneath its feet, and feed it names only when necessary. No one said those words aloud above a whisper. Still, the whispers found their way into notebooks as marginal jokes, into fireside talk as moodier shadows, into dreams as a door that did not open so much as choose. The disappearances continued, careful and spaced like beads on a string that did not want to look like a pattern. A fourth year with a promising thesis on torsion fields requested an audience with the council and was not seen at supper. A tutor who worked too long in the north wing left a candle burning in his room. The candle guttered without melting the last inch of wax. Fen counted names on the roster and did not say the number aloud. Lyre asked an administrator about Sarah and received a reply that was technically correct and contentless. The first open sign arrived wrapped in discretion. After a late drill, Kale found a slip of parchment tucked under the strap of his satchel. The handwriting was careful and unremarkable. "Your measure is changing. Hold it still." No signature. The paper itself smelled faintly of the herb. Archivists used to keep moths away from vellum. That night, a practice circle chalked on the dormitory floor lifted off the stone by the width of a hair and refused to settle until Kyle left the room. Fen stared at the floating ring and then at Kale's face. He said nothing. He pushed back his chair and kept vigil until the chalk lay down on the floor like a troubled sleeper. The next afternoon, during a lecture on domain boundaries, Master Verdun set a transparent prism on the lectern and passed a beam through it to demonstrate refraction across layered fields. The beam split obediently. Then Verdun angled the prism a fraction too far on purpose. The beam multiplied into a chaos of lines the diagram on the board failed to predict. He held the wrong angle long enough for students to feel their stomachs expect correction. Then he righted the prism. "That," he said, "is why rules are not an insult to talent." His gaze did not lift. The lesson was for the room and for the one person in it who knew how quickly a wrong angle could become a door. Shadows thickened at the edges of routine. The archivist who had once intercepted Kale's hand in the stacks now kept her distance, which meant she was very near. A senior proctor revised the sign-out rules for the lower arena to require 2 witnesses, then nodded Kale through with only 1. A groundskeeper's broom left tidy crescents of dust in the north wing, in places where broom heads do not reach unless hands guide them carefully around hinges. At twilight on the 4th day, as students filtered out of a strategy practicum, an older figure detached from the colonnade and matched Kale's pace. Magister Corin, veteran of 2 campaigns, beard cropped tight, reputation for fairness so dull it had become its own kind of armor, made no preamble. He led Kale along the periphery of the courtyard, where wardlight met ivy and the sound of the fountain covered low conversation. "Power is a rumor before it is a fact," Corin said, eyes on the stone-cut tracery above. "Rumors draw crows. Facts draw knives." He let that sit, and then continued, almost gently. "There are colleagues who curate what this place chooses to remember. They are not villains. They consider themselves custodians. When a room has too many custodians, the door becomes more important than the people who pass through it." Kale held still. Corin did not ask questions. He simply walked, hands behind his back, pace calibrated for distance without notice. The awakenings the histories do not record, Corin said, are not myths. They are infrequent, mostly uncontrolled, and very poorly tolerated. When they occur, two things happen at once. The first is attention. You have that already. He glanced toward the far arcade where a shadow paused at the second pillar and pretended to become stone. The second is attrition. Your friends will be asked to study elsewhere. You will be invited to succeed safely. He stopped at the carved relief of the figure with empty hands, the one every student learned to ignore. His thumb brushed a hairline seam at the wrists. The seam did not open. It pulsed once, faintly, as if remembering an oath. Corin's tone softened to something like an apology. Master Verdun believes he is doing the correct thing. He may even be right. The Council believes the Academy must survive you. It has practiced surviving prodigies. Wind crossed the courtyard and flattened the ivy for the span of 2 breaths. On the nearest balcony, Lear leaned into shadow and listened to the space between words. At the far end, Callan stood with his cohort like a banner pinned in place and watched for news he could use without debasing himself by asking. Corin stepped back from the relief and finally looked directly at Kale. For a moment, the practiced neutrality fell away and the soldier showed through, the man who had once had to measure consequences faster than fear. His voice dropped to a pitch that did not travel. If you keep using that magic, the Academy won't be your only enemy. Rumor turns into paperwork before most students eat breakfast. The day after Magister Corin's warning, a sealed summons arrives for Kale. Council Hall, 9th bell, immediate appearance, no delay. The wax bears the Academy crest, sunburst over, tower, pressed so deep it looks bruised. By now the Academy has a story about Kale, and it repeats itself in hallways. The weakling who rose, the duel that bent light, the teachers who started watching, the names that began vanishing from rosters. Even those who do not believe in forbidden things believe in momentum. Kale walks into the day with every gaze measuring distance. Fen waits at the foot of the stairs. He always waits. Borderland steady, the first to help carry books, the last to mock. Today his eyes won't settle. They called you? He asks, already knowing. Kale nods once. Fen opens his mouth, closes it, and says only, I'll be nearby. The council hall stands at the Academy's exact center. White stone polished to a mirror, doors of ironwood veined like a palm. Inside, cold. Light spills from a ring of skylights, pooling in a circular chamber without corners to hide in. 9 counselors sit at a raised dais behind a carved bar. Archon Maera at center, Provost Ilian to her right, Chancellor Sorel to her left, others ranked by seniority and reputation. Master Verdun stands at a side lectern, austere as a drawn line. Master Jarrell is present, jaw locked, chalk-stained fingers folded so tightly the knuckles pale. Students don't usually see this room. The floor itself exerts pressure, like standing too long in deep water. Kale of no house, Archon Mara says, voice stripped of everything but function. You are brought before the council on matters of safety and conduct. She does not. Say, forbidden magic. That phrase lives under the floorboards here. The opening is polite procedure, list of incidents, controlled duels, ward logs with blank entries. The obelisk's hesitations are read aloud like symptoms. Witness statements, carefully anonymized, describe anomalous curvature within the dome, localized density where light should run, and a sensation of gravity acting sideways. The language makes outrage sound like lab notes. Master. Verdun's report is precise. Subject demonstrates atypical modulation under pressure, he says, pallid gaze never lifting from the ledger. Deviation is small but consistent. Twice, the dome returned null classification. He does not look at Kale when he adds, deviation correlates with observed disappearances of destabilized novices in prior terms. A murmur threads the benches, the kind of sound bureaucrats make when a number fits a trend line. Master Jurel breaks it with a spare, reluctant sentence. He finished within parameters. Barely, Verdun replies. Archon Maera lifts 2 fingers and the air stills. We will proceed. The door opens on cue. A proctor leads in a witness with his hood down, face unmasked. Fen. He does not look at Kale. He stands in the witness circle as if measuring a cliff he must jump from, because someone has already set fire to the ground behind him. When he speaks, the voice is flat from rehearsals. I saw Kale alter the ward, not with sanctioned technique. The dome blinked. He knew it would. Each sentence scratches his throat as it leaves. He is not good at betrayal. That makes it worse. Archon Maera. Did you report this voluntarily? Fen's pause is a small death. Yes. Why? His hands find the seams of his sleeves. Because I want him to live. The chamber inhales, confused. Verdun's eyelid shifts by the width of a sigh. Even he did not expect that phrasing. Archon. Maera's tone does not change. You believe reporting your friend serves his welfare? I believe, Fen says, eyes fixed on the stone, that the Academy crushes what it cannot name. If he keeps doing whatever this is, and no one stops him, they won't crush him. They'll erase him. At least this way. The words are threadbare by the end. They have to look at him first. The council thanks him with the kind of civility used for useful pain. He is dismissed. He walks out steady, never turning. Kale watches the set of his shoulders and understands so much, and nothing at all. The questioning turns. The precision sharpens. Provost Ilyan asks about intent. Chancellor Sorel asks about sources. A senior counselor with scholar's hands asks whether Kale has ever opened a door that was not meant to open. The circle tightens. Every answer is a step on a narrowing ledge. Do you seek power outside the curriculum? No. Have you been instructed by any current or former member of faculty in techniques not sanctioned by the standard? No. Have you, alone or with others, practiced in restricted spaces? A beat too long before? No. A clerk, at the periphery, notes the pause with tidy script. A scribe enters it into a log that pretends to be indifferent. Master Verdun asks for demonstration. A simple circle, he says, smooth as winter glass. Then the bind you used against Dagon. Then the yield you presented to Callan's finishing line. A hush folds the upper benches. This room prefers talk to spectacle. Today it will have both. Kyle steps to the marked tile. The circle forms, steady. The bind follows, orthodox, textbook. When he presents the yield, the ward underfoot tenses. The room tastes the ghost of the hinge he set in the arena. He holds himself still enough to make the difference invisible. Still, a measuring crystal in a side niche pulses like a bird's throat. The counselors lean back as one. Decisions loves choreography. Questions resume, thinner now, incisive to the point of cruelty, because cruelty here calls itself caution. Archon Maera's last inquiry is soft. Do you understand what you carry? Kyle answers nothing. He has been taught silence can be safer than truth shaped by the wrong mouth. Silence, here, is an admission. The council has heard, Maera says, rising a fraction. We will confer. They do not leave. The dais recesses a hand's breadth. A veil of sound descends. Not invisibility, but courtesy. From the chamber floor, words blur into rhythm. Calm voices shift measure, one harsh syllable from Sorel, Verdun's winter, Ilyen's careful law. A vote is a machine, levers, weights, a click. The veil lifts. Faces resolve. Maera's mouth is a straight line drawn with a ruler. By majority, She says, "The council finds that Kale's continued enrollment constitutes unacceptable risk to student body and institutional integrity." The phrase lands like a verdict carved in marble because it is. Effective immediately. A chime interrupts. It is not a bell of class or ward. It strikes from within the walls, lower than iron, older than the Academy's own timetables. Every skylight dims a fraction. The dais shivers. A narrow door, no seam a moment earlier, appears behind the council and opens on a short passage of stone the color of riverbed. 3 figures step through, robes unadorned, faces calm with the confidence of jurisdiction. No sigils mark their hems. Their authority is the absence of needing to show it. Archon Mara's composure thins. "This chamber is in session," she says, which is less protest than proof she knows exactly who has come. The central figure inclines their head a degree and subordinate to ours when we choose to attend. A rustle moves through the benches like wind through paper. Few in the room have ever heard the name said aloud. Fewer still have said it without doors closing around them. The veil does not arrive in public. The veil arrives and the public learns a memory. "Proceed," says the robed figure mildly, as if Mayera had simply paused mid-sentence to breathe. Her jaw tightens. She finishes anyway. "Effective immediately. Expulsion. Stayed," the new voice says, without raising it. The word lands as function, not debate. A parchment seal splits invisibly. A chain of procedures breaks and waits to be reforged, under a different blueprint. Chancellor Sorrel half rises. "You cannot, we can." The figure's eyes settle on Kyle, not with warmth, not with pity, with an appraiser's interest for material that should not exist, and yet does. This case falls under a prior compact. That phrase drains color from 2 counselors' faces. Master Verdon's expression does not change. His stillness earns its own silence. Archon Mara breathes once through her nose, as if inhaling the taste of ash. She turns back to the chamber. "The council's vote is recorded," she says, clipped, immaculate. "By intervention of higher authority, its execution is deferred." The session gavel strikes. The room hears expulsion. The room sees it vanish in the same motion. Noise follows, bewildered, hungry, afraid. Near the door, Fen grips the edge of a bench until his knuckles go bone white. Up in the shadow of a pillar, Lear closes a book he did not open and keeps watching anyway. Along the rear rail, Callan's eyes gleam with a triumph he cannot own and a fury he cannot show. On the dais, the robed figures incline their heads to no one. The central one lets a single sentence cut through the chamber with the simplicity of a straight blade. This student is not dismissed. After the council's halted expulsion, Celestia behaved like a city after an earthquake. Walls still standing, streets still passable, but every step testing the ground. Whispers grew teeth. Doors shut a fraction faster. Lamps along the north, wing burned a cooler shade, as if the flame had learned restraint. The veil's intervention did not settle anything. It rearranged the battlefield. Kale became the center of a debate that never named him. Instructors exchanged courtesy with the tension of soldiers trading salutes across a contested bridge. Master Tiu. Verdun increased observation without accusation, appearing where he had not been scheduled, auditing ward logs, asking questions that sounded like statements. Master Jarrell ran drills until blisters broke and healed. His silence read like dissent. To some, loyalty to others. Magister Corin, marginal by design, adjusted routes, arriving where conflict threatened to become spectacle and where rumor threatened to become policy. Fragments surfaced, carefully, out of sequence, as if the Academy were testing how much truth the stone could bear. In the archives, a blue-bound history acquired a new erratum slip overnight, a correction to a century-old casualty figure from the Concordant Purge, a skirmish most students skimmed past. The revised number was smaller on paper and heavier in the mind. On a stairwell landing, a fresco long thought to depict a harvest festival had its grime cleaned. Beneath the soot, the dancers wore armor, and the flowers proved to be stylized sigils. In a lecture on harmonic wards, a senior theorist drew a diagram from memory, paused, then erased the innermost ring so completely the chalk dust refused to cling to the board. Names returned with dust on them: the Order of Light and the Yao, Keepers of the Abyss. Official histories reduced them to opposing cults, one championing discipline, the other seduction by excess. But the uncovered pieces suggested something more complex: two philosophies that had contended not for victory alone, but for the right to define the grammar of magic itself. The Order of Light believed the world survived because bright things could be measured and instructed. The Keepers of the Abyss insisted the world survived because darkness could refuse instruction, and in refusing, spare reality from breaking under too much certainty. They were not equal, and they were not kind. Between them, a war unstitched maps and rewrote calendars. It ended, the fragments insisted, not with a treaty, not with exhaustion, but with a single act that both sides chose to forget in the same way. That forgetting had a shape. Kale encountered it in places that did not speak aloud. When he traced a perfect academy circle in the lower arena, the inner edge sometimes wanted to unhook, as if remembering a hinge. When he lifted a lantern in the dormitory stair, the flame trembled toward his palm, not out of submission, but out of recognition. When he stood under the frieze of founders, the figure with empty hands seemed to tilt an imperceptible degree, as if ready to receive what no one would admit existed. The teachers divided along lines older than appointment. Verdun's camp, call them. The preservationists argued in formal phrases and tight smiles that Celestia endures because it denies itself temptations that have shattered other houses. Their watchword was, contain. Their strategy, document, isolate, reduce Kale to measurable habits until the dome could mistake him for ordinary. Behind closed doors, they asked whether the Veil had forgotten its charter or remembered it too literally. Opposite them were the instrumentalists, few and careful, who said less, in meetings and more in hallways. They did not romanticize danger, they logged it. But they also recorded a quieter truth. In years when the Academy refused every irregularity, the kingdom bled elsewhere. Light with no shadow burns the fields, one of their memoranda read. Unsigned, they did not propose license for Kale. They proposed utility. Train the anomaly, aim it. Between these poles, uncertain faces drifted, tutors with children in the novice dorms, scholars with a lifetime of careful work, ward engineers who feared blank entries on their ledgers more than they feared any one student. Celestia had survived the war by becoming a machine that converted panic into policy. That machine now met something it could not calibrate. Kale received fragments the way a shoreline receives messages in bottles, nicked glass, torn cork, half-legible letters. A psalm copied by a first year contained a stanza omitted from the sanctioned hymnals. When the sun stares at itself, the field goes blind. When the well refuses its bucket, the village lives. In a field notebook borrowed from the infirmary, a healer had sketched a symptom tree for luminous collapse. One branch, erased and redrawn, labeled a specific counteracting shape with a symbol that was neither rune nor word, a thin oval, open at one end. Even Lear, who spoke rarely unless precision demanded it, broke his reserve. On a balcony above, the practice yard, he stood beside Kyle without greeting. "The hinge you used," he said, eyes on the ward web below. "It felt as if the strike wanted to be wrong and you let it." He did not ask how. He was not sure he wanted the answer. "If you keep shaping it," he added, "you will have no equal for a time. And then you will have no peers, which is a very different problem." Callan chose a different weapon: ceremony. He hosted a study circle on foundational ethics in contest, inviting favored instructors, quoting statutes with courtly bite. Every polished sentence pointed toward the same thesis without speaking it. Power without pedigree should be disciplined by pedigree without mercy. When Kale's name surfaced, it did so as an example whose details could not be discussed in polite company. Effective rhetoric precisely because it fed on what could not be said. At dusk, Celestia's courtyards took on the color of old coins. Shadows thickened earlier. Students walked in pairs more often and looked over shoulders less by habit than by instruction. The disappearances that had begun as rumors solidified into absences respected by no one's jokes. Sarah's desk remained, dusted. Dagon's boots were stacked neatly under an empty frame. The Academy's ledger of withdrawals accumulated signatures that looked perfect until held in sunlight. Magister Corin kept to the edges, the way a man picks ground he can defend. He spoke to no counselor within earshot. He spoke to Kale, only when wardlight and fountain noise could cover the exchange. The Order and the Keepers both thought they were saving what mattered, he said quietly, as ivy rasped against stone. They were both right and very wrong. The thing that ended their quarrel was not a victory. It was an edit. Someone wrote a rule into the world and then taught the world to forget the author. He let the water's rhythm absorb the sentence, then added, "You are carrying an echo of that rule." He would not say more. Even that much cost him. In the observatory, a demonstration of mirrored domains went awry under innocuous conditions. Instruments hiccuped. The glass at the center of the table filmed over as if breath had condensed on the inside of reality. The phenomenon lasted a heartbeat and corrected, leaving behind a ring of cold that persisted too long for comfort. The assistant on duty logged the anomaly, drew a neat line through the entry, and wrote, "Retested, normal." The next day, the log was recopied. The line was absent. The note remained. The veil moved along corridors and through minutes like owners inspecting a house that belonged to time. Their presence carried a particular temperature. Not heat, not chill, but the feeling of pages turning somewhere you cannot see. When Kale crossed paths with one of their plain-robed members, the exchange was always courteous and always empty. Student, magister, a nod, averted eyes. The courtesy of people who did not intend to answer questions because they did not intend to hear them. In a closed colloquium of faculty, the argument finally broke the surface. Verdun presented a slate of restrictions: limited arena access, monitored casting, prohibition against unsupervised study in the archives. Containment is compassion, he said, and some believed him. A quieter group offered a different slate. Assign Kale to Corin for field tactics, pair him with Lear for control studies, expose him to structured stress to bleed the anomaly into habits the dome could predict. Harness it, or it will find its own reins, one wrote, not signing. No vote resolved the split. Celestia preferred stalemate to civil war. Through all of it, Kale kept a schedule like a pilgrim obeying a bell. He arrived early, left late, carried no contraband, spoke rarely. Under his palm, circles behaved. Under his breath, words bent around the syllable he would not say. In the dormitory, Fen occupied the chair by the door most nights without comment, the loyalty of someone who had betrayed to save and would be punished by both choices. The fragments threaded themselves tighter. An archival map of the old city revealed a seam running under the Academy grounds, labeled once as aqueduct, relabeled later as conduit, removed in the next edition. A mosaic under a layer of plaster showed two figures facing each other across a broken line. One haloed, one shadowed, both reaching toward the gap as if to close it with bare hands. A marginalia in a centuries-old sermon read, in a script that shook with age, "Do not let the sun see itself. Do not teach the well its depth." The conclusion crystallized even without a single declarative sentence. The war between the Order of Light and the Keepers of the Abyss had ended when someone, somewhere in this ground, took the obedient part of radiance and taught it to kneel, to a word that did not belong on any tongue. The same act wrote amnesia into the stone. Celestia survived by polishing the amnesia to a shine. What Kale carried, the hinge, the fold, the density that gave light weight, was the exact ghost of the mechanism that closed the war. The Academy's choice was as old as its foundations, and as immediate as breath. Grind the echo out of him, or guide it into a shape that would not break the dome. He did not hear the full argument. He felt it in the air. That night, the corridor outside Kale's door lay quiet, the kind of quiet that belongs to rooms waiting for news. Fen slept sitting up, head against the wall, one hand still on the strap of his satchel. The dorm windows showed a sky without clouds and stars pricked like deliberate notes on a staff. A sound slid under the door, paper against stone. Kale crossed the room. The strip was narrow, folded once, sealed with nothing but the pressure of the crease. The handwriting was exact and anonymous, the ink too fresh to smear and too deliberate to fade. Meet me at midnight if you want to know who you really are. Midnight struck like a held breath released. Celestia's courtyards emptied to their stone hearts. Ward lamps dimmed to embers, and the north wing wore darkness like a practiced disguise. Kale left his dormitory without a sound, passing Fen asleep. Upright in the chair, hand still hooked through a satchel strap that could not protect anyone from what letters deliver. The note's instructions were precise. Third stairwell, service corridor, door with no plaque, 3 soft knocks, 1 long. The corridor in question ran behind the archives, a spine of cool air and forgotten brooms. Moisture beaded on old stone. Somewhere above, the night watch hammered a distant hour into the roof beams, and the sound arrived in the passage as a shiver. The door opened on the 4th heartbeat. A narrow figure with a lantern stood within, hood back. It was not a student. Magister Corin's jaw was set, his gaze already measuring exits. He said nothing until the door was shut and barred. "Down," he murmured, and led the way along a stair that did not appear on maps, steps hewn out of a seam that had once been a watercourse and then not. The room they entered had been carved for absence. No heraldry claimed the walls. No wards announced themselves. Yet the air felt attentive. 5 others waited. A senior scribe from records, an archivist whose hands smelled faintly of cedar and dust, a ward engineer with ink ground into her cuticles, a junior healer with sleepless eyes, and a mathematician whose lectures never filled because precision is not popular at noon. They were not uniform in age or rank. They were uniform in the way they held still. These were the ones who chose friction over forgetfulness. They called themselves nothing. The ward engineer placed a flat prism on the table and turned it a fraction. A circle along the wall brightened, and the room layered itself with a dampening field that turned sound into the shape of a stone dropped into deep water. The archivist slid a packet of papers across. "Read," she said, voice low. "Then look at what the papers refused to say." The first folio was a copy of the Academy's foundational charter, the one every first year swore by rote without hearing it. In the margin, a hand from 50 years earlier had written in careful script. Article 7 originally read, "Preserve all knowledge, guard access, revision, preserve what is sanctioned, erase what endangers order." Beside the "I'd so" note, a dry petal was pressed so thin it had become paper. The second document was a set of casualty ledgers from the end of the Concordant Purge. One column listed names of fallen. The next, cause. In 5 places, the cause had been scraped and overwritten with accident during unsupervised experiment. The underlying strokes, held to lantern light, spelled suppression by council directive. The mathematician unfurled a diagram that resembled a cathedral floor plan until a second glance revealed it to be the old dome. Not the modern ward, but the lattice used 2 centuries earlier when Celestia's language about safety still remembered what it meant to be afraid. A small ink note in the corner read, "Emergency channel. Veil access only." An arrow pointed toward a junction labeled in a shorthand that belonged to engineers who wrote instructions for those who would follow them into fires. Inversion, enacted once. Magister Corin did not look at Cale while the papers spoke. He watched the room, then the door, then the lantern's wick. When he finally spoke, the voice was scraped clean. The council did not merely interpret history, it corrected it. A compact was struck after the war. The Order and the Keepers paid in memory. Celestia agreed to keep paying, to polish the forgetting, so long as the thing that ended the war stayed asleep. The ward engineer's mouth twitched at the word thing. Mechanism, she said, because engineers prefer nouns you can fix. A mechanism written into the world. It made light obey a command it was not designed to hear. We can feel the seam where it sits. It is under us. The healer slid a thin ledger forward, the kind physicians keep because bodies keep their own. Books. Symptoms logged during uncontrolled encounters, she said. Fainting, blood pulled toward palms, small circles that refused to close, hands shaking as if the weight of air had changed. Her finger tapped a line with pared nails. Survivors dreamed of empty hands. The archivist added a final sheet. An oath fragment, older than the charter, written in a discipline of ink that no one used anymore because patience had been shortened everywhere by clocks. We bind what we dare not break, and we forget who bound it, it read. The next line had been purposefully cut away. The tear was smooth, like a surgeon's work. Cale absorbed the fragments like cold. The conspiracy did not dress itself in hoods and daggers. It wore amendments, repair, policy. The council had rewritten what could be asked aloud. The veil had maintained the erasure with rituals only those who maintained rituals remember. Students like Sarah and Doggin had walked too close to the seam. The academy had swept. The ledger had learned new handwriting. Magister Corin looked at the table as if something under it could be persuaded to change. There are those who will say this was necessary, he said. Perhaps it was. Perhaps it still is. But necessity is the word institutions use when they want to behave without witnesses. Lear stepped from the far shadows then, where he had stood without being noticed, a habit he had practiced long before he needed it. He did not join the table. He leaned against the damp wall, eyes on the prism. The hinge he used in the arena. He said to the engineer, "Does it rhyme with your inversion?" The engineer's gaze cut to Cale's hands and back. "It tastes like it." The scribe from records unfolded a final proof. A page from a prior council session, redacted nearly to blankness. One unblacked line remained, whether by oversight or arrogance. We will call it benevolence. Silence settled. Not empty, full. The kind of silence in which a person learns the outline of the fight they are already in. The archivist, who had said the least, finally raised her eyes. "This room is not rebellion," she said. "It is a ledger kept in ink that water cannot lift. We cannot overthrow the council. We can decide whether the forgetting continues with our hands." Corin added nothing to that. He reached into his coat and set down a small iron token stamped with the Academy crest on one side and blank on the other. It had the weight of a coin and the promise of nothing. "If you carry this, doors may open that should not," he said, "or close sooner. Pieces of the veil recognize it. Not all pieces agree with each other." Kyle did not reach for the token. The decision to take it would be recorded by everyone present and by the room itself, which remembered in ways stone should not. Instead, he asked the only question that steadied the table. "What happens to those who know too much?" The healer did not look away. "Sometimes they transfer," she said. "Sometimes they retire." A beat. "Sometimes the ledger acquires a cause that looks tidy from a distance." Lear's jaw flexed once, a rare flinch. Corrin's attention drifted to the ceiling where Damp had traced maps no cartographer would publish. "You are not fighting Callan," he said at last. "You are fighting a system that survived the last war by pretending it never ended." The prism flickered. The dampening field thinned for a heartbeat and then returned. The engineer stilled, eyes on the door. The archivist's hands flattened the oath fragment, as if the paper might otherwise crawl away. From the corridor beyond the barred entrance, a sound arrived out of place. The soft misstep of a foot that knows its work, but not this floor. A breath, held too long. The faintest kiss of metal against stone. The scribe extinguished the lantern with fingers that had done it often. Darkness took the room, leaving shapes in a low blue from the prism's edge. The engineer's hand hovered above a panel that could dissolve the table into the wall. Corrin's weight shifted toward the second exit that was not visible when light had been present. A neatly measured voice filtered through wood as if the door were a veil of water. It did not push. It observed. "Citation records for this chamber are irregular," it said softly. "Master Verdun." The rebels did not move. Their stillness felt like a net with all knots pulled tight. From farther down the corridor, a second voice, patient and pleased. "Irregularities confirm function." That was not Verdun. It belonged to the kind of custodian who believes removal is the purest form of care. The engineer bled the dampening field to its limit. The prism hummed at a pitch that made teeth ache. A sliver of light from under the door recorded the shadow of a man who knew where to stand to hear most and reveal least. Lear spoke without sound, lips shaping a verdict that needed no air. Compromised. No one reached for the iron token. The barred door did not open. It did not need. Amidst the message in the corridor had already crossed the threshold. The rebels were seen, if not named. Proof existed, but proof had entered the game where proof becomes dangerous. On the table, the oath fragment curled at the torn edge, as if remembering the missing line. Outside, in the sleeping academy, the hour turned, quiet as a blade returned to its sheath. By dawn, the academy knew something it could not quote. The underground meeting had not been raided, yet the air carried the flavor of discovery, the way a room changes after a secret is set inside it. Wordless cues spread like frost. Doors that once swung easily required 2 pushes. Proctors appeared at intersections that rarely needed them. The north wing lamps burned a colder white, as if the wicks had been instructed to distrust their own flame. Betrayals began not with accusations, but with absences. The scribe from records failed to appear at her desk. A junior healer traded rotations and never took the new shift. The ward engineer's workstation was cleared to a sterile gleam. Students told each other stories that kept themselves safe. Sarah had transferred to a coastal academy. Dagan had returned home to apprentice. A tutor had accepted a post in a provincial court. The ledger agreed. The ledger always agreed. Kyle moved through the day under observation disguised as courtesy. Master Verdun corrected posture with a touch of the cane rather than a word. Master Jarrell added a new series of drills whose timing punished anyone who glanced at the north wing. Magister Corrin rearranged routes and arrived precisely where conflict threatened to rip protocol. Lear watched the spaces, not the faces, and Kaelin hosted another ethics circle glistening with polite venom. Fen shadowed corners with the loyalty of someone who had already betrayed once to save, and had discovered that salvation costs the same as harm. By evening, rumor had taught itself. A script. He altered the dome, whispered a third year on the way to supper. The veil rescinded the expulsion, countered another, half awe, half warning. Only because they want to use him. Only because they're afraid he'll become what ended the war. Only because became the chorus of the day. After lights out, the academy's quiet changed key. Kale left the dormitory with care, keeping to shadows that had always been friendly to those who needed them. The flagstones carried a chill that did not come from weather. At the second landing, a figure detached from the stairwell gloom. Not Callan, not Liar. A proctor with a suppression rod held like an apology. "Student," the proctor said. Polite, formal, inevitable. "A word with the council, now." Two more stepped from either side of the corridor. Behind them, ward marks on. The wall brightened, lines thickening in preparation for containment. Farther back, the soft rasp of a broom on stone paused and did not resume. The groundskeeper listening to a story he could not afford to hear. Cale moved. He did not sprint down the main hall like a novice with stolen fruit. He slipped into the servants' run, narrow, brick-throated, lined with hooks where kitchens once hung pots to cool. The proctors followed, measured rather than frantic, a shepherd's hunt rather than hounds off the leash. At each junction, another pair joined. Rods low, voices calm. "Stop. This is unnecessary. You'll be safer if..." The corridor tightened into a dogleg where the academy had grown around older stone. Here, the air carried the tang of wet iron. Ahead, a portcullis of wardlight barred the way, a lattice tuned to stun and hold. Kyle raised both hands as if to surrender, palms open, fingers slightly spread. A hinge closed between them. It was not visible. Visibility would have been a confession. The space learned, briefly, to prefer one angle to another. The lattice did not break. It remembered a different geometry and flexed. Cale passed through a slit that existed for the span of 2 heartbeats, and then sealed, leaving the ward intact and outraged. The nearest proctor's step faltered. The rest of the sentence did not trust the floor. The chase threaded, the academy's innards, under the lecture hall of convergence, past the laundry where steam rose from traps that breathed like sleeping lungs, along the edge of the lower arena where the dome slumbered with one eye half open. At each turn, Cale met a barrier he was not meant to solve and offered it a choice. Most barriers prefer being asked to being told. As he ran, the whispers came. They were not thoughts and not orders. They gathered in the corners of rooms, in the shadowed mouths of stairwells, in the hairline seams where stone remembered being sand. Claim. The word had once been invitation. Now it arrived as appetite. Another voice, older, braided beneath it. Refuse. Tone without syllable. Weight without shape. He did not answer. The academy would count any answer as evidence. At the south cloister, a suppression net fell with the quiet of snow. Cale felt it a breath before contact, the air repudiating edges, strategies dissolving into softness. He dropped to a knee and touched the flagstone. A shallow fold pressed into brightness and gave it mass. The net sagged, surprised into heaviness, long enough for him to roll free and cut left through a door meant for gardeners. A cloaked figure stepped from a hedgerow at the cloister's far end, hands empty, posture readable as neither threat nor aid. Lear. His gaze mapped vectors, not faces. "East passage," he said, low, already moving. "Third arch is unkeyed." He did not wait for thanks. Thanks are a luxury when the clock is bent against you. They cut through the oratory where old banners hung like molting snakes. 2 proctors entered from the opposite side. Liar angled the benches with a foot. Small shifts that force a pursuer's stride to stutter, and Kyle threaded a seam between conduct and sacrilege. At the oratory's rear, the third arch led to a blind. Except tonight, it did not. A maintenance panel had been left ajar by hands that knew why. Beyond it, a crawl space had room for a man if the man did not insist on dignity. Liar stopped at the threshold. "You'll fit," he said. "They won't." His eyes narrowed, listening not to proctors but to the building. And something hates that panel. Go. Cale slid in. Stone and dust scraped cloth and skin. The whispers narrowed with him, pressing close as if a mouth had approached an ear. Claim, refuse, claim, refuse. Beneath both, a third suggestion. Remember, not a command, an ache. A rod struck the panel frame. The clang traveled along the crawlspace with metallic certainty. Another strike, another. On the fourth, a suppression charge crawled through the opening like a bright insect. Cale pressed the hinge against air, not to deflect, but to thicken. The charge slowed, as if pushed through honey. Its light dimmed to the color of bruised fruit. It died with a disappointed sigh. He emerged into the catwalk above the upper rehearsal hall. Below, students had left instruments mid-phrase after evening practice. A harp exhaling a last note, drums holding breath, a scatter of bows abandoned, like lost decisions. The catwalk hummed with old resonance. Proctors barreled through the door behind him, rods raised, confident in the physics of patrol. Cale stepped onto the narrow rail. The hall inhaled. Wood, gut, air, all the materials that know how to remember sound. The whispers joined, not as words now, but as a chord found in the grain of the place. Claim, refuse, remember. He took the line across as if following that chord. Each step a note placed where it belonged. A rod crackled at his ankle. He folded brightness and let the charge slide into the floorboards. Sparks walked along the rail and jumped off at the far end like children abandoning a game. From the catwalk, a service ladder led into the rafters, then down into a gallery that emptied near the archives. He dropped the last rung, rolled through dust, and tasted cedar. The smell snapped memory into a shape. The archivist's careful hands, the pressed pedal, the margin note that had corrected Article 7 into obedience. A figure stood in the aisle between stacks, lantern-shaded, back turned. Not Corin, the archivist. Her voice did not rise above a breath. "Stop 3 shelves before me," she said. "Then go left. There is a door that was bricked over. It was never mortared right. You will think you are breaking rules. You are only breaking plaster." Bootsteps entered at the far end. Proctors. And, behind them, the pause that accompanied Master Verdun. The archivist lifted a book as if consulting, a catalogue. "You are in the wrong wing," she called in a voice that could have been anyone's. "The boy you want is being disciplined in the lower arena." "Thank you," Verdun said, as if accepting a correction to a ledger he had already balanced. His cane tapped once. 2 proctors kept coming. Cale found the bricked door. Age had turned mortar to chalk. He pressed a hinge into the seam and asked, "The wall to remember being a threshold." The plaster shivered, powdered, and fell in a sheet. Cold air moved through a space that had not been air in a century. He slipped through. The archivist did not look his way. The passage beyond bit the lungs with ancient damp. He ran bent, skimming along old conduits and breathless arches, the academy above him beating like a heart through stone. The whispers rose with the pulse. Claim, refuse, remember. A 4th now, thin as hair. Choose. He emerged near the east courtyard, where statues of founders watched with eroded patience. The figure with empty hands seemed nearer than stone should. Permit. Across the court, silhouettes converged, proctors, 2 instructors, and Callan's cohort, called to witness or to gloat. Callan stood slightly back, immaculate, the rare stillness of a man who understands that spectacle is unnecessary, when the moment will remember itself. "Student," Master Verdun said, not shouting. "Authority has no need of volume. Stand down." Cale's breath smoked in the chill. Behind Verdun, Lear appeared at the edge of a colonnade, eyes narrowed to splinters. Fen pushed through a knot of onlookers, face white with more than fear. Magister Corin stood by the east arch, hands open, posture set to catch a falling beam and the consequences after. Kyle raised his palms, a show of emptiness. The Academy waited like a drawn bow. The whispers crowded the space behind his teeth. Claim, refuse, remember, choose. They stacked into a sound like wind through wire. The urge to reach for the hinge sharpened until it tasted like metal on the tongue. The urge to do nothing pulled like undertow. He did neither. He turned to the side, toward a line of ivy that clung to stone warmer than the night allowed, and stepped away from every plan the corridor had prepared. The proctors adjusted, good at their work, sweeping to flank and close. The first rod sparked. The second sang. The Academy made the decision for everyone. Alarms tore through the night. Deep, ancient, older than the bell that measured classes, older than the chime that summoned counselors. Red wardlight bled along roof lines. Sigils ignited over arches like eyes snapping open. The message braided itself into the clangor so no one could pretend to have misheard. By order of the council, a voice boomed from hidden horns. Kale of no house is declared heretic. Students froze mid-step and mid-thought. Proctors hesitated, recalibrating from apprehension to doctrine. Callan's face did not move. His knuckles whitened where he held the rail. Lear's mouth flattened into the line he wore when numbers betrayed him. Fen took a step toward Kale and found 3 rods aimed across that distance. Above them all, the Academy's alarms kept speaking. Relentless, ritual, certain, until the word heretic settled on every surface like ash. War arrived not as a declaration, but as a geometry. Lines of force scraped across courtyards, sigils kindled over arches, rings of wardlight blooming like iron flowers. The accusation of heresy struck the Academy and split it down paths no architect had drawn. Students ran, then stopped running, then chose. Some moved toward Kyle by instinct, the ones who had watched him refuse humiliation without spectacle, who had felt the dome stutter and read hope in the stutter. Others rallied to the by standards of authority, drawn to the gravity of clear orders and bright law. The rest hesitated at thresholds with books still under their arms, waiting for someone to turn this back into a lesson. The first clash broke at the east courtyard fountain. Loyalists formed a crescent under the gallery, shields braided from sanctioned light, lines drilled to catch and turn. Callan stepped to the fore, cloak cut to move like command, voice calm as a blade. Hold formation, measure, don't chase. His cohort answered with a thrum of readiness, sigils synchronizing to his cadence. Above them, a senior tutor set a ward canopy that filtered everything not on the syllabus. Opposite, those who chose KL arrayed without standard drill. Fen counted angles and bodies, and made a shape out of people who had never practiced together. Archers of light on the flank, shielders in a staggered sawtooth, 2 quick casters tucked behind the fountain lip. They lacked polish and possessed nerve. Lear drifted to their edge, not quite belonging, hands behind his back as if thinking could be a weapon. Kale did not take a place at the point. He stood half a pace behind Fen's improvised line. Attention, on currents rather than show. Around his fingers, the air tensed, the hinge not formed, the possibility of it coiled like muscle. Callan signaled. The Loyalist crescent advanced in a glide, spears of radiance lancing in a disciplined lattice designed to punish rashness. The first rank from Kale's side raised shields late enough to be honest about fear, and early enough to matter. Impacts rang hollow through ward glass. A quick caster on the right returned a braid that would have been clever in a practicum and was insufficient here. Callan cut it in 2 with a short, exact motion, never overreaching, never giving the crowd the flourish it wanted. The battlefield learned both sides at once. Stones remembered previous drills and complained under different footfalls. The fountain's spray sheared sideways where pressure argued with order. Above the fray, the alarm bell's low toll layered with the hiss of sigils and the boom of techniques meeting their countermath. Kale stepped, when the shape required him. A plate of loyalist ward dropped hard toward Fen's front, calibrated, to stun and bind. Kale placed a thin fold at its lip. No display, only a sentence quietly edited, and the plate arrived an inch to the left of where it wanted to be. Fen slid through the gap and tapped the plate's underside. His shiver of light canceled the bind clause and left it heavy and useless on the stones. That small victory breathed air into their line. Exhales turned into shouts. A girl from the border cohort loosed a bolt that stitched loyalist shields together for a moment, and 3 quick casters filled the seam with legal heat. Callan adjusted. He pulled his left wing back and wheeled his right, turning the crescent into a hook meant to fold Kale's allies against the fountain. The maneuver carried Academy elegance and field cruelty. It would have worked on anyone expecting the arena's mercy. Lear ruined its timing with 3 gestures that were not spells, but refusals to let the world be careless. Benches shifted 3 fingertips. A flagstone that had been level since the last renovation remembered it was older and settled a hair. The hook stumbled. Fen shouted a number, and Kyle extended his palm, adding weight to air for a single heartbeat, just enough to thicken the stumble into a stall. A burst from their hidden quickcasters landed true for the first time. Loyalist shields flared, held, and dimmed unevenly. The battle spread. Galleries that had watched generations of tournaments filled, with students firing from cover. Courtyards became chessboards where pieces improvised rules. Stairwells turned into throats that choked on too many feet moving with opposite intentions. A pair of tutors argued ward theory mid-sprint while skirting a detonation. A librarian herded wide-eyed first years behind a stack of statute books and made law literal. In the lower arena, the dome woke fully, humming like an offended god, and refused entry to anyone not wearing a proctor's band. Callan surged, disappointed that cleverness needed this much explanation. He accelerated his center, the airs. Acceleration, 3 beats quiet, 1 beat surgical, and pierced. His spear of light did not look larger than the others. It behaved as if the world had been expecting it. Kale answered with orthodoxy and patience. He bound, yielded, bled force along engineered curves, and bought seconds. Seconds matter. In the second bought at the fountain's rim, Fen pulled a fallen loyalist clear before a heavy plate collapsed. In the next, a novice with shaking hands remembered a calming exercise and stopped his shield from flickering. In the next, Lear pointed at a nothing corner, and 3 allied casters sent their bolts there, striking a bypassed ward crystal that blew a loyalist canopy off its moorings. The Academy retaliated in the only way it knew. It tried to make everything a classroom again. Canopies reset, horns standardized alarm intervals, and the main quadrangle reorganized its paving lines to guide feet into old formations. But Celestia had never taught a class on 2 truths being right at once. The campus architecture stuttered. One wing obeyed the loyalists. Another remembered the way Kale's edits felt good in its joints. Doors meant to close early waited for him longer than for others. Lamps shaded him, then shivered with shame at their disobedience. Combat tightened around the East Arcade, where the frieze of founders looked down with blank neutrality. The figure with empty hands seemed to lean toward the fight, Stone unable to refuse interest. Callan and Kale found each other properly for the first time since the Declaration. They did not speak. Language would have made this smaller. Callan opened with the heir's grammar, a cut that contained doctrine, heritage, and the exact angle that had won duels before he had been born. Kale declined the grammar. He stepped aside as if the cut had arrived in a different era, and the era had been inconvenient. Callan followed with a vertical line bright enough to bleach color. Kale sheared it into a spill with the hinge not fully made, the way a careful hand lets ink bleed into intended paper. They circled as the battle contracted and expanded around them. Loyalists pressed when Callan pressed. Kale's allies held when his footwork said hold. Students who had shared tutors and jokes traded technique with sobbing breaths and eyes that would remember each other for the rest of their lives. A loyalist band tried to flank via the cloister. Lear intercepted with 3 gestures and a timing. Theft. Their captain's command arrived half a beat late in his own ears, and the flank dissolved into noise. Fen took a bruise meant to shatter. He stayed upright and laughed once, sharp, astonished, and went on building shape out of chaos. Callan began to escalate. The spear of radiance coiled into an axis, and from that axis, lines marched outward, clean, inexorable, sanctioned. He had not shown this in public before. A murmur rose from both sides, the sound of people recognizing a name they had never been taught. Cale felt the architecture of it, right down to the numbers. He could match pieces. He could not match inheritance. A thought arrived uninvited. The only way through was the wrong way through. He hesitated. The battlefield noticed. Fear edged the hesitation. Fear of becoming the proof of the accusation. Fear of teaching the dome to like the taste of improper geometry. Fear of what his hands might do if he let them tell the truth they had learned. Under the north wing, Callan pressed, efficient, merciless, in the way a judge is merciless when the code leaves no room. Cale lifted his hands and chose. The hinge closed. Brightness gathered between his palms, not as radiance but as weight, the feeling of a syllable that stones understand and flames resent. The air buckled where his circle should have been. Loyalist bolts arriving at that wrong circle curved like birds into a storm. A canopy line above the arcade drooped, as if remembering rain. For 3 heartbeats, the battlefield behaved like a room with an unacknowledged guest. Gasps and curses rose together. Some of Cale's own faltered, seeing too much of the story they had been warned against. Lear's lips thinned. He watched the mathematics and winced at the beauty. Fen did not flinch. He shouted positions as if the world were still polite. Callan saw the opening inside the wrongness and leapt. He laced his spear with a clause the dome loved, a pure compliance clause, the kind that makes reality choose sides. The spear struck Cale's hinge and recoiled. The recoil did not disperse. It found a path no diagram had written and ran it backward, up the spear, into Callan's arm, into the loyalist lattice keyed to his rhythm. The lattice moaned. Ward crystals along the arcade's edge flickered in sympathetic pain. A stained window at the oratory spidered. Dust snowed from a cornice, as if the building were clenching teeth. The loyalist formation shuddered. The allied line sagged, spell shock crawling through wrists and elbows. Callan set his jaw and dragged, the recoil into a holding shape by will and pedigree alone. It cost him. Sweat silvered his hairline. The cut of his shoulders lost a degree of parade. Cale stood at the fulcrum he had made. The hinge pulsed, greedy now, recognizing itself in the Academy's skeleton. The whispers swelled into more than sound, memory of a rule written in that same skeleton, eager to be read aloud. Claim, refuse, remember, choose. The last word deepened until it sounded like falling. He saw himself as the story would tell him if he took another step. Not champion, not reformer, but instrument. He saw, too, what inaction meant. Callan's lattice would close. The Academy would reassert arithmetic, and the veil would complete whatever compact it had dusted off for him. He set his foot. The duel ceased to be 2 men and became calculus stamped, across stone. Callan poured sanctioned radiance into a spiral, designed to grind the hinge into harmlessness. Kyle pinched the spiral's throat and taught it to prefer a smaller circle. Every correction propagated through canopies and shields. Loyalist ranks bent. Allied ranks bent in response. The fountain's water began to climb its own column as pressure forgot which direction it owed loyalty. A crack ran down the pillar beneath the founder's frieze. The figure with empty hands leaned further than stone allows, and did not fall. Far above, the observatory's glass filmed from the inside, as if sky were a pond contemplating freezing. Both sides felt the threshold. Instructors shouted doctrine, until their voices broke. Proctors hammered suppression rods into the ground and begged the dome to care. The dome answered by humming at a pitch that made eyes water. Callan bared his teeth. Not anger, effort, and summoned what heritage keeps. For moments it once remembered. A column of light so disciplined it carried its own silence. He drove it down. Kyle lifted the hinge fully for the first time. Light met weight. Silence met refusal. The column folded as gracefully as a tower falling into its footprint. The university groaned. The shock traveled through foundations and up the spires like a question hurled into a cathedral. Tiles leapt. Stone remembered earthquakes in different eras and rehearsed them. A supporting arch beneath the gallery spat a wedge. The wedge struck flagstone and cracked it. The crack ran. Students staggered. Some screamed. Some laughed in the way people laugh at their own funerals and dreams. Lear threw 2 countertones into the air to keep the rafters from agreeing with the crack's logic. Fen dragged a novice clear, before a falling finial could write her name into the floor. Callan and Kael, locked into each other's math, kept feeding the shape they hated feeding, because the only other option was to let the other write the ending alone. The Academy, for a heartbeat, decided to choose neither. A deep note sounded under everything, older than bells, older than charters. Lamps guttered. Sigils across every arch blinked, confused. The hinge in Kael's hands dilated. The column around Callan's arm condensed. The 2 shapes recognized a kinship neither side wanted to admit. The courtyard brightened and darkened at once. Then the world took a breath that did not belong to it, long, slow, and heavy. And the duel escalated past anything the dome had ever been asked to survive. The courtyard had become an amphitheater for calamity. Cracked flagstones radiated from the last impact like the rings of a struck bell. Ward sigils guttered along the eaves, failing and relighting in a strobe that made the Academy look like a memory flickering out. Students crowded the galleries, pressed shoulder to shoulder in a silence so taut it could have been snapped with a fingernail. Proctors held suppression rods without conviction. Teachers stood in ranks that resembled a prayer more than a plan. Callan stepped forward, cloak torn, hair ash-dusted, the discipline of an heir hammered into every line of his posture. Sacred light gathered to his call, not as glare, but as law, measured, pure, a radiance that refused to be anything but vertical. Opposite him, Kael steadied at the lip of a fractured circle, breath even, palms open. Between his fingers, the air darkened. Not like nightfall, but like pressure. A hush, given weight. It was the cold open, made present. The banners overhead hung ragged and ember-burned. The sky had the color of iron quenched too fast. Somewhere a bell tried to ring, and could not find its clapper. And on the central stone, 2 figures faced each other with the promise that one would end the other, or the place that made them both would end first. Callan spoke only once, formal as verdict. "Stand down." Kael did not answer. Language would have shrunk the distance into something survivable. Callan moved first. Sacred light lanced from his hand in a column narrow as a blade's width, striking not at Kael's body, but at the geometry that allowed him to be where he was. The ground hummed as if remembering how to obey. Kael's right palm closed an invisible hinge. The column met an angle that had no precedent and skated. Heat went sideways in a silent shriek, shearing a groove through stone and carving its own echo into the far wall. The crowd exhaled in a sound that had no cheer in it. Callan did not chase the near miss. He ascended. Bands of light stepped into being around him. 3, 4, 5, each a ring of discipline keyed to the next. He reached up and drew a spear from the highest band. Its shaft sung into exactness by the ward itself. When he cast, the spear flew unerringly, not across distance, but along obligation. Kael answered with the opposite of a shield. A seam opened in air, a fold that taught brightness to weigh itself. The spear consented to a curve it had not been, meant to know, yawed, and buried itself harmlessly in a fountain's stone lip, with a sound like a sealed door sighing open. Steam jetted, hissing the word no one dared. Forbidden. Whispers in the galleries. Black fire. No, worse. He's bending the frame. Make him stop. Teachers did not move. Some could not. Master Verdun stood with cane planted, eyes winter pale and unblinking, taking the measure of a catastrophe he had tried to govern by will. Magister Corrin's hands flexed, then stilled, a soldier sighting a bridge and counting lives on either bank. Lear stood under the arch's shadow, attention knifed thin. He looked not at the duel, but at the invisible mathematics. The duel was writing into the stone. Callan raised both arms. The rings above him resolved into a haloed lattice, a crown rendered as architecture. Light descended in measured planes, each pane a law. Where the planes intersected, the world sang the note of compliance. Under that music, most magics in Celestia bowed their heads. Kale's hands fell to his sides as if in surrender. Then his fingers turned, and the shadow between them caught fire. Not fire that burned, fire that refused. Black flames climbed his wrists, veined with a violet no natural spectrum could permit. The blaze was cold enough to crack. The air warped around it the way a mirror buckles under a weight. The nearest ward sigil dimmed as if embarrassed. The first pane of Kalen's lattice touched that wrong flame and recoiled as if it had met a memory. The second pane did not recoil. It tore and recomposed around the flame's edge, shaking the way a singer shivers when a note arrives from a place outside their ear. Callan's jaw tightened. He stepped through his own light like a general striding his own lines and brought the duel to the ground. They met in the center. Callan's strikes wrote straight lines that stabbed from premise to proof. Kale's responses kinked those lines and showed them other answers. The courtyard became a chalkboard wiped and rewritten mid-sentence. Arcs, cancellations, furious substitutions. Sacred light cut, black flame folded, stone took notes in cracks. A bolt of radiance grazed Kyle's shoulder. His head snapped, the world narrowed, and the black flames rose higher, licking the sky with a hunger that frightened even those who wanted it to win. Fen shouted something about angle and cover, and was dragged back by a senior to save him from his own loyalty. A first year sobbed until the sound went voiceless. A tutor gripped the gallery rail hard enough to split skin and did not notice. "Stop," someone whispered without believing it could be heard. Callan's advance sharpened. He braided sanctity into speed, the spear now humming with a clause that made space snap to grid lines. He pressed until Kale's heels kissed the fault running through the courtyard. Kale dipped his hands into the black fire and came up with a shape no language owns, a kernel of absence dressed in flame. He set it against Kalen's next cut. Light and not light collided. Sound arrived late. The concussion wrapped the courtyard in a muffled punch. Banners snapped. Dust rose in a ring. Every candle in the oratory guttered at once. For 3 seconds, all sight wore a gray veil. When sight returned, both stood upright, lungs heaving, eyes locked. Callan pivoted into a form that had made his house famous. 3 beats preparation, 1 beat annihilation. The spear collapsed into a length of white-hot line, and he swept. Stone behind Kale vaporized into a glassy crescent. Kale stepped into the sweep and under it, the hinge wrapping the cut like a hinge wraps a door, and thrust his own palm forward. The black flames concentrated to a point that looked like a wound in the day. It did not touch Callan. It touched his spear. Light howled. The spear drooped as if a muscle had torn. Callan regripped, forced purpose back into it, and drove on. The duel rippled outward. Canopies faltered. Windows webbed. The dome above the lower arena thrummed at a frequency that made teeth ache. The Academy's geometry, its proud, patient arithmetic, found itself insulted and answered with structural complaint. Mortar powder drifted from arches like pollen, trees in a storm. The horror on the watchers' faces was the horror of a book being unlearned while they held it. Master Verdun lifted a hand half a finger and lowered it again. To intervene would be to enter the equation and break in a place he could not afford to break. Magister Corrin took a half step forward and stopped at the line between necessary and ruin. Lyre's lips moved, counting beats like a metronome trying to hold a collapsing orchestra in time. Callan drew down once more. No theatrics, only rigor weaponized. The lattice brightened, hair rose, the world leaned toward law. Cale answered with the black flame not as spectacle but as surgery. He made it small as a nail, then placed it precisely where Callan's rule had no claws. Metal met bone, in abstraction. The courtyard lurched, the duel tilted toward its end. Cale felt the hinge pulling him. A tide with a voice now, claim, 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 so crisp it had consonants. Under it, another tone, refuse, turned the same word into a different. Command, memory welled, the hidden library, the mechanism, the old oath cut clean. On the galleries, faces blurred into a single demand. Stop him, save him, stop him, save us. Callan hurled the last doctrine in his inheritance, a column of sanctified silence driven straight through the center of the square, the kind of strike, not meant for contests but for wars. It fell with the weight of a verdict. Cale lifted both hands and let the black flames devour their own edge. The hinge opened to its fullest, a dark iris swallowing the column's center and feeding the edges back to themselves. The impact did not explode outward, it collapsed inward. For an instant, the world made a shape that tables cannot hold and maps cannot show. Catastrophic fallout arrived as order deciding to leave. The eastern colonnade shrugged. An arch coughed stone. The fountain twisted around its own spine. Windows imploded. Shards blossomed inward. The oratory's organ vomited a chord that had been waiting since it was tuned. A ward crystal burst into powder with a sound like a held breath finally spending itself. Several students went down under a rain of history. Shields, thrown too late, chimed against falling. Callan and Cale were thrown apart like pieces spat by a machine. Callan's back took a pillar. The pillar cracked and did not choose a side. Cale hit the center stone and slid, the black flame snuffing to a rim around his hands, then guttering like a star ashamed of itself. Silence occupied the courtyard, with the arrogance of a conquering army. Then sound trickled back. A cry, a cough, the collapse of some small, late thing. The hiss of steam, where sacred light had overcooked the fountain. A sob choked into a hand. The sky rolled its shoulders and remembered being sky. The Academy, wounded, furious, settled to a new angle. Cale tried to rise and could not. Callan tried to rise and would not. They lay on their separate stones, chests struggling, eyes unfocused, the echoes of what they had invoked still wandering the rafters like homeless bells. Around them, allies and enemies shared the same stunned inventory. Fingers, lungs, blood, friend, stranger, still here. Master Verdun crossed 3 paces as if wading hip-deep against a current no one else could feel. Magister Corrin stepped down off the stair, measured the distance to both boys, measured the distance to the falling pieces of the Academy, measured his own years, and chose stillness because movement would make him a fulcrum and break something that could not be repaired. Lear looked from Callan to Cale and back again, and understood with a clarity that made him want to vomit that the mathematics was not done. With them, not yet, not kindly. Fen shoved past a proctor and skidded onto his knees near Cale, hands hovering, not daring to touch, not able to stop himself. Kyle. He breathed, and the name came out like a rope thrown across a river. The courtyard held its breath. On the broken pilaster, Callan's fingers spasmed once, twice. His eyes opened to slits, caught light, rejected it, closed. He exhaled, a strip of sound that tasted like iron and old pride. Across the way, Kale's ribs lifted, his jaw clenched, his hands, burned without heat, spasmed around nothing. The black flame flickered in memory along his fingers, and then went out. His eyes opened. They were not anyone else's eyes but his. One of them rose. Dawn found Celestia listing on its foundations. The courtyard where the duel had torn the night lay cratered and glossed with a thin glaze of fused stone. Windows gaped like missing teeth. Sigils along the colonnades sputtered to life and died. Again, as if breath itself had been made unreliable. Smoke rose from the oratory in a bruised column. Where the fountain once kept perfect time, water coughed in fits and fell back into a basin marred by a black glass seam. Word outran the sun. The Academy had survived, but something older than brick and oath had been cracked. The council convened at first bell with faces set to law, only to meet a hall dense with watchers, students, tutors, proctors, the seldom-seen clerks who made rules into reality. The veil stood at the back, unbadged, unannounced, and undeniable. When Archon Mara called the roll, 2 counselors did not answer. One's chair bore a neat folded cloak, the other a ledger stamped closed. The hall understood without being told. Absence had become a policy. Master Verdun read from ward logs that refused to agree with themselves. Measurements blinked into nulls, reappeared out of sequence, and recorded effects without causes. Magister, Corin listened with the stillness of a soldier who has slept beneath collapsed roofs and knows what groans will be followed by dust. Jarrell placed chalk on the lectern and did not touch it. The session did not so much end as exhaust the room. Factions, hardened by noon. Preservationists gathered around Verdun and a tranche of senior faculty, arguing that Celestia had kept the kingdom alive by sanding down its edges. What could not be named could not brand the world twice. Instrumentalists, smaller and dangerous, in their certainty, met in corners and spoke of harnessing what Kale carried before it found its own work. A third, quieter current refused both camps and counted heads, doors, and escape routes. They were professionals of survival and had too many names to be a faction. Outside the chamber, judgment distributed itself like ash. In the galleries, students traced Kale's path in whispers, some odd, some furious, some using his name like a charm and some like a warning. Novices tried on the word heretic in private and flinched at the sound of their own mouths. Fen, whom rumor elevated and misunderstood in a single breath, shouldered through tasks with a stubborn calm that kept him from breaking. Finding cots, carrying water, counting who did not answer at roll call. Lear returned to numbers. He collected shards of ward crystal and listened to their last notes, sketched fault lines and countertones, and discovered more questions than equations. When asked what he thought of Kale, he said only, "He is carrying a grammar that does not belong to a single throat," and went back to the map. Kalen, bandaged and immaculate even in defeat, convened his cohort with the measured cadence of a man who intends to shape memory. The Academy must be saved from its enemies, and from those who would save it by breaking it. Kyle woke to the sound of linen and hammered silver. The infirmary smelled of salt, smoke, and boiled angelica. A screen had been placed around his cot. Beyond it, the overflow of wounded made a rustling sea. The healer on duty drew back the screen with a frankness that did not stoop to fear. "You're not dying," she said. "That's the good news you can afford." Through the window, he could see the far arcade propped with scaffolds, the founder's frieze veiled to keep faces from falling. He asked no questions. The room had too many answers. The black scorch along his palms had retreated to a shadow, but it remained like a brand worn on the inside. A tray of water sat untouched until Fen pushed it into his hands and said nothing. Neither spoke of the night. Neither needed to. Between them, something had been spared, and something else had been lost, and both would take equal time naming themselves. Grief arrived as inventory. Names that had filled benches were suddenly rooms walked around to avoid the hollow. Sarah's seat in the stacks gathered dust that no one disturbed. Dagon's boots were folded under a bed that would be reassigned by policy before sorrow could finish its work. A novice who had played the harp in the rehearsal hall ate bread in perfectly square bites and did not look out the window. A tutor said a lesson on harmonic lattices and stopped speaking when Chalk traced a symbol with the wrong muscle memory. If Kale walked a corridor, reactions arranged themselves into a liturgy. Some stared like pilgrims at a relic. Some stood aside, the way one stands for a funeral procession. Some followed at a distance, tallying his steps for the ledger of their fear. Hands reached toward him for blessing, and pulled back as if he might scorch. He became the shape other people used to name themselves: bold, cautious, faithful, apostate. The Academy, expert at turning lives into examples, found in him a lesson for every angle. He did not seek crowds. He trained in quiet yards whose walls remembered fewer things. Master Jarrell supervised with the economy of a man who knows a scaffold can either save or crush. Again, Jarrell said, and Kyle bound light the sanctioned way until his wrists ached and the black flame pretended to be smoke in his blood. Again, and Kale yielded along orthodox curves until the hinge inside his hands begged to be seen. Again, and Jarrell watched for the right wrong and said nothing when he did not see it. Corin sometimes appeared at the far wall, shook his head once when temptation thickened the air, and left a single phrase behind. Win small, letters multiplied, official summonses, anonymous pleas, condemnations written in tidy hand and sealed with personal crests. Thanks from no one brave enough to sign. One note traced in childish carefulness said, "My brother is alive because you were there." Another, bearing a house seal Kale could not fail to recognize, said, "You have proven the council correct." The paper weighed the same. The words did not. The veil sent no messages and made itself present everywhere. Their silence was a policy Kale could feel on his skin. They reorganized patrols, rewired wards, and redrafted the language of discipline to accommodate the thing they would not name. Council ordinances began to arrive with new clauses: supervised study in the archives, escorted passage in the North Wing, revised definitions of emergency that were both generous and precise. The Academy learned how to watch without being seen. It was an art Celestia had taught itself during older winters. In corners, scripture from another age resurfaced. An old hymn was sung with its missing stanza restored. A quiet verse that warned against mirrors. The chapel filled for once, not with piety, but with relief at having a place to put voices that quivered. A legal scholar stood at a balcony and read Article 7 aloud to anyone who would listen, then read the earlier version from a copy that smelled like starch and rain. Students stopped to hear the difference between preserve and erase. The space between the words felt like a wound that would not accept stitching. Guilt followed Kale like weather. It wore the faces of those who had not risen from the infirmary beds. It spoke with the voice of the archivist who had left the bricked door for him and had not been seen since. It sat on the rim of the fountain and tapped the black seam with a fingernail until the sound found his teeth. Fen tried to empty the air of that sound by speaking of border rivers and ice clear as glass. Kale listened and thanked him and heard water over stone anyway. In a corridor lit by lamps that learned to dim for him, Lear stepped from shadow to fact. "You taught the world a line," he said, gaze on Kale's hands. "It will write that line again if you let it, and if you don't." The sentence held no accusation, only an exhausted admiration for a problem well named. Callan passed them later with courtesy universal as winter. His nod to Kale was flawless. His glance at Lear contained the half-syllable of a future argument. By evening, the campus had subdivided into maps on which everyone was an arrow. Loyalists drilled hard and smiled sharp. The uncertain packed bags quietly and studied transfer, procedures with the same diligence they once applied to conjuration. A small, stubborn cohort gathered around Fen, training in orthodox techniques with terrifying exactness, as if mastery could be a shelter against policy. They did not speak Kale's name loudly. They did not speak it less. Repair crews threaded scaffolding through fractured galleries, setting braces where rhetoric could not hold up stone. Proctors carried urns of powdered ward crystal like relics. A lecture resumed in a half-collapsed hall with students sitting on the floor. When a crack ran audibly through the far wall, no one moved, as if movement might be what finished the break. Toward dusk, as the sky dulled to iron and the first birds remembered the roofs, a question traveled the campus and attached itself to voices that needed a shape. Would you keep a power that cost you everything? It was asked by a novice to a window, by a proctor to a ledger, by a teacher to a locked cabinet, by Fen to nobody and everyone at once. It hung in dormitories where sleep did not fold down cleanly, in the archives where pages had begun to rustle, first and be read second, and in the infirmary where those who woke stared too long at their hands. Night returned with a tired step. Kyle crossed the dormitory corridor late, shoulder-brushing stone that hummed differently under the hand than it had 2 weeks earlier. A narrow envelope lay on the floor inside his door, slid there by a hand, that left no sound. No seal held it closed, but the paper bore an imprint that was not wax, the pressed memory of a circle with no circumference, and a line that ended by refusing to end. The characters on the front did not belong to current alphabets. They belonged to the architecture. He unfolded the note under lamplight that hesitated before admitting its own brightness. The script inside curved with old patience. The Academy was only the beginning. The ruins of Celestia did not fall silent. They hummed like a book that had been slammed shut mid-sentence. Scaffolds rattled in the courtyards, ward lamps burned with nervous flickers, and the surviving students walked the galleries as though the stones beneath their feet had learned to listen. The duel, the fire, the fracture. Every heartbeat in the Academy carried its echo. But amid the debris, a larger question stretched its wings. Was it better to obey the traditions that had preserved order for centuries, or to break them and risk letting something forbidden reshape the world? The story had begun with Kale, a boy mocked for his weakness, a student who stumbled through classes and barely clung to the bottom rung of Celestia's hierarchy. Tradition demanded he remain small, an example of failure contained by rules. Yet it was in breaking those rules, unearthing the forgotten library, touching flames that should never have burned, that Kale transformed. His rise was not celebrated in triumph alone. It was carved with scars, marked by the loss of friends, and shadowed by the suspicion of every authority figure who watched. From weakness, he had grown into strength. From isolation, he had become a reluctant center of gravity. Around him, factions splintered, loyalties broke, and voices whispered his name with reverence or hatred. He had not asked to be worshipped, nor had he sought to be feared, but both titles had been forced upon him. And in that tension, hero to some, heretic to others, Kale became what Celestia itself could no longer ignore. Proof that one life could disrupt centuries of silence. Yet even as the Academy counted its wounds and rebuilt its wards, the story resisted conclusion. Every step Kale had taken revealed shadows wider than Celestia's walls. The Order of Light and the Keepers of Vi, the Abyss, factions thought buried by history, left their marks in every fragment of scripture, every hidden sigil, every whispered hymn. What began as a student's duel had exposed fractures in the very foundation of the kingdom, fractures too large for scaffolds or ledgers to mend. And so the question lingered like smoke in every hall. Better to obey tradition or break it? Callan, heir to the nobility, had stood for obedience, wielding sacred light with the weight of law. Kyle, outsider with nothing to lose, had stood for defiance, wielding black flame that obeyed nothing but itself. Their clash had not given the Academy an answer. Instead, It had given everyone a mirror, and the reflection was far more dangerous than either victory or defeat. In the quiet hours after the duel, Kale stood at the window of his dormitory, looking out across scaffolds and smoke. He did not feel like a savior. He did not feel like a monster. He felt like someone carrying a burden that had not finished naming itself. Tradition had tried to erase him. Defiance had nearly destroyed him. Somewhere between those extremes lay the path he would have to walk, alone, but followed by eyes too numerous to count. The world beyond Celestia waited. The letter sealed with ancient markings still lay unopened on his desk, its presence heavier than any weapon. If the Academy was only the beginning, then the war outside its walls promised revelations and enemies greater than any duel. Kale's journey had pulled him from weakness to strength, but strength was no refuge. It was only an invitation to a wider battlefield, and so the story closed where it had opened, not with answers, but with a question. If you held in your hands a power that could unmake centuries, would you obey the traditions that had kept the world safe, or would you break them in search of a truth no one was ready to face? To everyone who has watched this far, the invitation is yours. What do you believe lies ahead for Kale, for Kalen, for Fen, for Lear, for the fractured halls of Celestia? Leave your predictions for Chapter 2 in the comments below. Your theories may shape the way this journey unfolds. And remember, this academy was only one battlefield. The war outside its gates, the war that rewrote history itself, is just beginning. The ruins of Celestia did not fall silent. They hummed like a book that had been slammed shut mid-sentence. Scaffolds rattled in the courtyards, ward lamps burned with nervous flickers, and the surviving students walked the galleries as though the stones beneath their feet had learned to listen. The duel, the fire, the fracture, every heartbeat in the academy carried its echo. But amid the debris, a larger question stretched its wings. Was it better to obey the traditions that had preserved order for centuries, or to break them and risk letting something forbidden reshape the world? The story had begun with Kale, a boy mocked for his weakness, a student who stumbled through classes and barely clung to the bottom rung of Celestia's hierarchy. Tradition demanded he remain small, an example of failure contained by rules. Yet it was in breaking those rules, unearthing the forgotten library, touching flames that should never have burned, that Kale transformed. His rise was not celebrated in triumph alone. It was carved with scars, marked by the loss of friends, and shadowed by the suspicion of every authority figure who watched. From weakness, he had grown into strength. From isolation, he had become a reluctant center of gravity. Around him, factions splintered, loyalties broke, and voices whispered his name with reverence or hatred. He had not asked to be worshipped, nor had he sought to be feared, but both titles had been forced upon him. And in that tension, hero to some, heretic to others, Kale became what Celestia itself could no longer ignore, proof that one life could disrupt centuries of silence. Yet even as the Academy counted its wounds and rebuilt its wards, the story resisted conclusion. Every step Kale had taken revealed shadows wider than Celestia's walls. The Order of Light and the Keepers of the Abyss, factions thought buried by history, left their marks in every fragment of scripture, every hidden sigil, every whispered hymn. What began as a student's duel had exposed fractures in the very foundation of the kingdom, fractures too large for scaffolds or ledgers to mend. And so the question lingered like smoke in every hall. Better to obey tradition or break it. Callan, heir to the nobility, had stood for obedience, wielding sacred light with the weight of law. Kale, outsider with nothing to lose, had stood for defiance, wielding black flame that obeyed nothing but itself. Their clash had not given the Academy an answer. Instead, it had given everyone a mirror, and the reflection was far more dangerous than either victory or defeat. In the quiet hours after the duel, Kyle stood at the window of his dormitory, looking out across scaffolds and smoke. He did not feel like a savior. He did not feel like a monster. He felt like someone carrying a burden that had not finished naming itself. Tradition had tried to erase him. Defiance had nearly destroyed him. Somewhere between those extremes lay the path he would have to walk, alone, but followed by eyes too numerous to count. The world beyond Celestia waited. The letter sealed with ancient markings still lay unopened on his desk, its presence heavier than any weapon. If the Academy was only the beginning, then the war outside its walls promised revelations and enemies greater than any duel. Kale's journey had pulled him from weakness to strength, but strength was no refuge. It was only an invitation to a wider battlefield, and so the story closed where it had opened. Not with answers, but with a question. If you held in your hands a power that could unmake centuries, would you obey the traditions that had kept the world safe, or would you break them in search of a truth no one was ready to face? To everyone who has watched this far, the invitation is yours. What do you believe lies ahead for Kale, for Callan, for Fen, for Lear, for the fractured halls of Celestia? Leave your predictions for Chapter 2 in the comments below. Your theories may shape the way this journey unfolds. And remember, this academy was only one battlefield. The war outside its gates, the war that rewrote history itself, is just beginning.